resume in public session. The purpose of the first part of this morning's engagement is to consider a proposal to opt in under Protocol number 21 to a measure in the area of the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. A briefing has been circulated, and I want to at the outset welcome the Minister of State at the Department of Justice and Equality, Deputy David Stanton, and I believe also Enterprise. Is that not the case? No. Hands full with, yes, I understand, Justice and Equality. Deputy David Stanton, former chairman of this committee, and also your officials with you and in the gallery. Before we begin, members should be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Now, I'd now like to invite Mr. Stanton to make his opening statement.
Thanks very much, Caoimhghín, and thanks for. I want to thank the members of the committee today for making time available to discuss this proposal. The purpose of these motions is to seek Oireachtas approval to exercise Ireland's options under Protocol number 21 annexed to the Treaty of the Function of the European Union, that's the Lisbon Treaty, in respect of a proposed amendment to Regulation EU number 516/2014. As the committee members are aware, Ireland and the UK negotiated a protocol known as Protocol 21, which provided that they would not take part in measures in the area of asylum integration and other policies relating to free movement unless either member state choose to opt in to an individual measure. The effect of this is that Ireland is not automatically bound by EU measures in these areas unless it notifies the Council that it wishes to participate or opt in. Ireland may opt in by notifying the President of the Council in writing within 3 months of the publication of a proposal in order to vote on the measure and participate in it. Following recent conversations in the European Parliament and the European Council, the Commission proposed to make an amendment to the regulation regarding the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, that's AMIF. In this case, Ireland would have expected the notification period to expire on the 15th of January 2019. However, Ireland was notified that in order to allow for the adoption of these amendments before the end of this year, the Council Secretariat wished to move this vote in the European Parliament on the 10th of December 2018. The effect of this is that if Ireland wishes to opt into the proposal, the President of the Council of the European Union must be notified of our intention before the 10th of December 2018. This allows just 2 months to complete the opt-in process, which is obviously a very heavily administrative process as well. Now, the reasons for the proposal. The proposal relates to the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, which is essentially procedural in nature. It will allow unclaimed funds, that's the Asylum, Migration and Integration Funds, which would otherwise be lost by the end of this year, to be available for future spending. It will do this by, one, allowing an extension of the time period in which the funds may be used and allowing Member States to make revisions to their national programmes to use the funds for other actions as defined by the regulations. Ireland has €4.14 million of unclaimed AMIF funds allocated in its national programme for the relocation of asylum seekers, which will be lost by the end of 2018 unless the regulation is amended. By opting into the proposed amendment, if the European Parliament votes it in, Ireland is guaranteed that this money can be allocated by way of a revision to our national programme for AMIF. Ireland would also have 2 more years to use the remaining funds. So I'll just give a background to the proposal, Chairman, by way of a summary of the funds and the Council decision in question. The EU Commission wanted to establish a policy on asylum and immigration based on solidarity between Member States, which is fair towards third countries and their nationals. Regulation EU number 516/2014 established the funds to provide financial resources to support policy developments in the area of asylum and migration. This fund allows Member States to carry out actions in the areas of asylum, immigration, management of migration flows, fair treatment of third country nationals residing in Member States and combating illegal immigration and trafficking in human beings. Ireland opted into the regulation and the EU approved its national programme in this area in 2016. The programme identified the specific objectives for which Ireland would use AMF funding. Ireland's current allocation under AMF is €52.6 million for the period 2014 to 2020, which represents the lifetime of this AMF fund programme. In 2015, in response to the migration crisis in Europe, 2 Council decisions, EU 2015-1523 and EU 2015-1601 were made, which committed an additional €843 million to Member States under AMIF to be used by the end of 2018. This additional funding was aimed at enabling the relocation of applicants for international protection from Greece and Italy and the legal admission of persons in need of international protection from Turkey. These additional AMIF funds facilitated the effective relocation across the EU of 34,705 applicants in need of international protection from Greece and Italy, and the legal admission of 5,345 people in need of international protection from Turkey. The timeframe and the applicability of these decisions are now coming to an end. Of the €843 million originally committed throughout the European Union to deal with the crisis, approximately €567 million remains unspent. Unless the proposed amendment to the regulations is passed before the end of this year, the €567 million will be lost to the fund, or from the fund. Under the 2 Council decisions of 2015, Ireland committed to accepting 2,622 persons into the state, 1,089 from Greece, 623 from Italy, and 910 was unallocated. To date, 1,022 persons have safely been relocated to Ireland from Greece. In addition, Ireland has also been operating a programme for resettlement. That's programme refugees, under which 925 persons have been resettled. Many Member States, including Ireland, were unable to keep their commitments to relocate asylum seekers from Italy, as no agreement could be reached on security assessments to be undertaken by Ireland on Italian soil. As a result, €4.14 million of Ireland's committed funding remains unused. On other provisions on this proposal, there are 4 main provisions of the proposed amendment to the regulation, and I'll go through those now, Chairman. As I explained, the first objective of this proposal is to enable the use of the remaining unspent amounts which have been committed under AMIF to support EU priorities in the area of migration and asylum, including relocation. Failing to opt in will mean that Ireland will lose out on €4.14 million of our AMIF funding. Secondly, by amending Article 18 of the regulation, the proposal recommits the amounts in question for relocation. It will also give Ireland the option to transfer these funds to other areas defined in the Asylum, Migration and Integration Regulation, which are based on Ireland's specific needs in these areas. Therefore, Ireland will have a say in how the funds can be used and has the option to have them channelled to specific objectives as required. Thirdly, the proposal inserts a provision into Article 18 which revises the decommitment rule set out in Article 50 of Regulation EU 514/2014 General Provisions, so that the remaining amounts can be used for an additional period of 2 years. As a result, by opting in, Ireland will have 2 more years in which to spend the funds. Finally, the proposal extends the deadline for an automatic decommitment of amounts by a period of 6 months. This gives the Commission time to complete the necessary procedures and allows Member States to identify revisions to their national programmes and include new areas where the funds could be allocated. This is money that has already been budgeted by the European Union. No additional funding from the Union budget is necessary for the implementation of the proposed amendments by Regulation number 516/2014. Therefore, there will be no additional cost to the Exchequer, and the decision to opt in will not have implications for Ireland's contribution to the EU budget. There are just some concerns raised about a precedent here. Are we setting a precedent? Italy and Finland have raised concerns concerning the proposal and have indicated that they will not support the negotiating mandate to the Presidency. Their concern relates to their view that a number of Member States did not abide or only partially abided by their obligations to relocate persons in need of protection to their territories. Italy has also expressed the view that this proposal also broadens the scope of the initial provisions by encompassing actions which cannot be considered as an expression of solidarity, in contrast with the objections pursued in 2015. Concerns have also been expressed by Member States in regard to the precedent that this proposed amendment may set regarding recommitment of funds which were due to be decommitted or was handed back. The Minister of Finance has also raised this issue. The matter is addressed by a proposal in the amendment stating that this only applies on a once-off basis to this fund, to the AMIF fund. So, Chairman, this proposal is to be welcomed as it ensures that money committed to Ireland will not be lost and that additional funds may be claimed for the Exchequer for the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, which would otherwise not be possible. The proposal does not present any fundamental policy difficulties for Ireland. I am of the view that Ireland should exercise this opt-in in respect of this proposed regulation. There are clear benefits to opting in, and I see no detrimental effects of doing so. Also, bearing in mind the declaration by the European Commission that this proposal will not set a precedent for future AMIF funds, and I hope the committee can support the exercise of Ireland's opt-in and in respect of this proposed regulation. So, Chairman, I look forward to any comments that members may have, and I'll do the best I can to answer any questions that people might want to put in respect of this particular proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. We have 3 indications at this point, and Senator Francis Black was the first of those.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister, for coming in today and for your presentation. And I did read the briefing document, which was circulated as well. And I'm, you know, I really am. This fund is great in a way that it's, you know, used to support a number of really positive integrative initiatives, and I do strongly welcome it. But there's one piece on the briefing document that I just wanted to ask you about, and I quote it, and it says, "The efficient management of migration flows." I find this wording a little bit concerning, given the context of the EU-backed agreement between Italy and Libya. I mean, on paper, the Italy-Libya deal is in place to manage migration flows, but a young Irish journalist recently called Sally Hayden, she actually recently won an Irish News Award for coverage of what it actually means in practice. And what she says is it's to stop people arriving in Europe. EU money has funded the Libyan Coast Guard to return thousands of desperate people to war zones and detention centres in contravention of the principle of non-refoulement. So, you know, we know one of the 4 key pillars of the fund is up for discussion today is return. But in 2017, for example, we spent 3.2 million and about 450,000 went to a delegated authority in the repatriation unit of INIS. I'm just wondering, Minister, can you provide some information on what this money covers? And could you confirm that none will go towards returns to conflict zones that are clearly unsafe, like Libya? And can I just ask one other question, if that's okay? Based on figures given in response to a parliamentary question in October, this is the underspend we're talking about. The fund has been in operation since 2015. In that period, we've spent roughly 6 million. Today, we're essentially being asked to roll over a portion of underspent money for another 2 years, which comes to roughly 4 million. So I was just wondering, Minister, could you expand a little on why this money wasn't spent? And I know money can still be allocated to 2019 and 20, but it still seems we're going to come on budget. So I worked with fantastic projects on the list of applicants, from football clubs to refugee organisations. Is it a case that not enough organisations are applying? And similarly, if there is an underspend, and this is the real question I want to ask you, is there not a case to be made that we could use this extra money to welcome more refugees, that the small number now that have been already accepted? So thanks very much. Okay,
Senator, Minister, would you like to respond, please?
Yeah, there are a number of questions there. First of all, this proposal will allow us to, as I said in the introduction, to allow unclaimed funds which otherwise be lost before the end of the year to be available for spending, for future spending. It allows an extension of time, obviously, and allows us to make revisions on national programmes to use the funds for relocation as well as other actions. So we're very anxious to actually do this now, because if we don't, we lose the money. That's the first thing. With respect to the situation between Libya and the European Union, yeah, I would be concerned about that, certainly. Would agree with what's happening there. But again, anybody that we return, they're not returned to conflict zones, and we would be anxious if some people come to Ireland and they find that they want to go back home, that we'd actually facilitate that, and that's paid for as well. So they can actually be returned to their own homes, own countries, if they wish. And a number of people do that each year, and I can supply the committee with the figures for that if you wish. So people do that when they come here, they want to go back. As I said, there's no cost to the Exchequer, but we will have additional funding available because of that. The other questions were just... I'm
just wondering, could we want me to kind of ask you again the second question, just around the underspend? Could we use the extra money?
The reason was that we were anxious to take people from Italy, as I said in my introduction there earlier on, and we had quite a lot of discussions with both previous Minister Taoiseach and myself and others at official level had discussions with Italian representatives at all levels, ministerial level and so on. We gave a commitment here that we would carry out security checks on people before they came in, because we didn't want to be in a position where somebody would arrive in here, something would happen, and then I'd be asked, well, what checks did you carry out before they came in here? And so the Italians weren't allowing that. They wouldn't allow us to have any Gardaí on their territory, you know, interviewing people who might be coming here. And we were of the view we couldn't bring in people from Italy unless we did that, so we were at an impasse. We tried everything to break that, and it didn't work. So we didn't spend that money then that was allocated to bring people, to relocate people from Italy to Ireland. And that money is unspent, and that's where we're at now with the funding that we are trying to use for other purposes. Otherwise, we lose it.
Thank you.
And it is dedicated aside to relocation as well, this fund.
Right, Minister Buramacha Fisher, Deputy Clare Daly, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister. I suppose what we're talking about here is the funding of what is a failed plan against the backdrop of really desperate need. And I just want to maybe make a few points in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of Europe, and a few questions there. And then a few questions in terms of Ireland itself. I might maybe split them into two. But I suppose the fund, as the Minister said, was adopted in 2014. Added to in 2015 because of the growing crisis in terms of the numbers of refugees, with the specific goal and commitment that for the relocation of 160,000 refugees. And to date, only a quarter of that has actually happened across Europe, which is frightening. When you look at situations of where these people are, in the likes of Camp Moira in Greece, which was home to 8,000 people in the summer. It was only built for 2,000. We know children as young as 10 were committing suicide, people spending 12 hours a day in line for food, stabbings in food lines, 80 people per shower, 70 people per toilet, an absolute hellhole there that people are desperately trying to get out of. So against that backdrop, an underspend is an appalling vista to me. We know large of that, as the Minister says, 4 million is due to Ireland. Now, in terms of Ireland's amount, we agreed under these decisions and this fund to accept 2,622 people. We accepted about half of that. Half. None from Italy, as the Minister said, but of the others, you know, half of the overall total, which is absolutely, we're not the worst in Europe, but we're pretty down the bottom of the pile. Obviously, Hungary, Poland took nobody, Austria took about 15, and so on. So I suppose my first couple of questions are, you know, given that there are about 60,000 refugees in Greece on the mainland, 14,000 on the islands, what is Europe's plan to deal with these people? And I suppose, can we get a commitment from the Minister that at European level we're pushing to ensure that refugees who want to get out of Greece are going to be relocated? I mean, are we carrying on the work of relocating refugees from Greece? I note our relocation scheme ended in March of 2018, and why is that happening? I suppose I note as well that the European Parliament's amendments to the proposal extended the range of nationalities eligible for relocation. This was a huge issue actually in terms of thousands upon thousands of Afghanis, Iraqis, Sudanese and so on not qualifying under the scheme. So I presume that the government supports that part of the proposal, and can we get a commitment that we will be fighting to support the extension of the nationalities covered under the relocation? And in that vein, I suppose maybe if we could get the Minister's thoughts on the quota system, because Donald Tusk talked recently about the quotas being divisive and ineffective. Are we to take it from this fund now and the fact that you can spend the money on anything else other than relocation, that the EU is moving away from relocation? Are we keeping people in these hellholes in Greece, or what's the story? I mean, about 23,000 refugees arrived in Greece this year, down from 850,000 in 2015. That's not because the need isn't there. It's because of the money being spent on border wall, on fences. It's because of the EU-Turkey deal. And is that it? Like, is that the EU's policy for dealing with this? Keep them there and don't let them come in. But, you know, I'd just like a bit of a comments on that. I have some specific Irish questions, but I don't know if it helped the Minister for me to come back in, or do you want me to throw in the Irish ones as well?
Well, look, we'll take a response
Yeah,
to that
and
first, and
yeah,
then you could
just a couple of Irish ones, yeah.
Fine. Minister, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Again, I would just want to recognise Deputy Daly's commitment and interest in this area. And certainly what happened in Syria is absolutely shocking and appalling. We know that, and we've seen we've been following what's going on. With respect to, as I said at the start, under the protocols, Ireland opted in voluntarily to this, so we didn't have to, but we did. We were asked to take 2,622 persons into the state, 1,089 from Greece, 623 from Italy, and 910 weren't allocated at all by the European Union. So to date, we've taken in 1,022 people have relocated to Ireland from Greece. There's another 600 under resettlement to come next year. We've also operated a programme for resettlement. As I said, 925 people have been resettled from Lebanon, from camps in Lebanon here. And there's another 200 before Christmas coming in. So we are a very, very small country. We are doing our best to actually bring people into Ireland from the camps in Greece and Lebanon. We weren't able to bring people in from Italy, as I said, even we tried very hard to do so. And we're still working on that. We haven't given up on it. So that's what the numbers are. 20% of the funding will be for relocation. And we also support NGOs and others with some of this funding as well.
So in terms of the extension of nationalities, are you supporting that in the proposal?
Well, it's
an amendment to the proposal, like it would,
Yeah. Well, at the moment we've been focusing on Syrians and Eritreans. They're the people we've been looking at, but and Iraqis. So they're the people that were in greatest need.
Well, I'd actually put it to you that the forgotten story now is what continues to happen in Afghanistan and Sudan and so on, and places like these. I mean, can I take it from your answer that we don't support that in the European Parliament? We're not supporting the expansion.
We haven't been approached on that at all.
Well, it was before the European Parliament, so I assume.
Yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see what comes from there.
That would strike me as deeply worrying, because there are a range of nationalities that are in danger who are not being accommodated. And I mean, if we're saying that the EU didn't give us the other 9, we didn't make our target because they didn't give us any, it's indicative of how at EU level the plan is failing, I suppose, which was my point,
Now, as I said, there was no time limit on this as such, so we have commitments next year as well, so that might change as the time moves on. So we'll keep that. I'll take note of what you said.
Okay, just on a couple of Irish things. Please, I know I am conscious of time and that. In a recent PQ response, Minister, you had said that 85% of the refugees who arrived in Ireland under the relocation and the resettlement programmes have been housed. Now, what percentage of those specifically came here under relocation, not resettlement, have been housed? Because if it's anything close to 85%, I think that's incredible, given that we have 4.14 million left over. And given that the proposal, that an amendment to the proposal that we're discussing was made by the European Parliament last week, to the effect that Member States should be allowed to use their recommitted funds on things like developing family reunification, promoting effective integration of third country nationals, as well as for relocation programmes. Is it intended that the government will do this? I mean, can we see a bit more what you plan to do? Will you use it for purposes broader than relocation? I mean, it's great that 85% of the mostly Syrian refugees who came here under these programmes have been housed. But there are loads of people in direct provision who've got their status who can't leave because they can't get housing. Can the money not be provided to that, rather than enriching the private owners of direct provision in our efforts to open more and more direct provision? We've 4 million sitting there and loads of people have their status who can't get housing. So the housing element, and rather than taking up the time, throw in my other 2 quick things. I mean, given, obviously we're going to discuss tomorrow the family reunification bill that passed through the Seanad, which I believe that the government isn't supporting, but given that family reunification is mentioned a number of times in the European Parliament's amendments to the proposal, would it not be an idea, you know, to change our stance on that, use some of the 4 million to allow people to be reunited with their family members? I mean, it's cruel to allow people to stay here and then not allow their families to join them. You know, you could be leaving a grandparent stuck in the type of hellhole I described in Greece, or a 19-year-old kid who's too old. I mean, there is ministerial discretion there. There's money there. It seems appalling that we're not using it. And, you know, the last thing is just in terms of the resettlement that the Minister mentioned of a further 945 from Lebanon. We know that the European Commission recommended last year that Member States should offer at least 50,000 resettlement places here by the 31st of October 2019. Do you know how many places have been pledged at a European level by Member States under this recommendation? Is it anywhere near the 50,000, in other words? And could we really not be given pledge a bit more than 335 this year and 600 next year, given the scale of the crisis? And has there been any discussion about that?
Right, Minister, those are the specific questions.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Well, first of all, I suppose the general attitude is that we can actually use the funding for quite a lot of the issues that the Deputy mentioned. We have that freedom to do that. There is people in direct provision in the main are asylum seekers who are a different group of people to the people who we bring in from Lebanon or from Greece, or indeed from Italy, if we could, who would be either refugees when they arrive here or become refugees shortly after they arrive here. They get status very, very soon after that. So resettlement are people we bring in from Lebanon, and relocation are people we bring in from Greece. So there's a difference there as well between the two of those. The pledges so far, and I can go through those. Let's see now. There are various government decisions made. The total resettlement pledge that we've made is 1,185. That's the total resettlement pledge. And that's up to 2019. That's to be admitted up to the end of next year. And there might be a further request during the year as well, which we'll look at when it arrives, from depending on what the need will be from the Commission. That's now, with respect to the housing. Yes, the number that I gave in the PQ is correct. Now, I did visit some Syrians 2 weeks ago in Donegal who have been rehoused, and I sat down with them and spoke with them, and they're extremely happy with how they're being rehoused. They also have a settlement worker who stays with them for, I think it's 18 months, who actually assists them with the integration process. Learning English is a big issue. Children actually learn English quite quickly and pick it up very, very quickly. Adults, especially men, find it a lot more difficult and more challenging. But we have the resettlement workers with them to help them with that, and classes in the ETB and so on. This is happening in 19 counties across the country. So, yeah, the resettlement the housing program is going well with respect to the program refugees and the people that we bring in from Greece, as I said. But it is great to see people in houses, in homes, and settling down and getting involved in the community. And I must say, communities. I was in Drumshanbo recently, and the local community there put on a welcome party or celebration for Syrians who were housed in Drumshanbo, and the whole community came together with the refugees, and it was great to see the actual welcome that they gave to them and the support they were giving to them. So people want to do that. Just as a matter of interest, we're also, I just say to the committee, because the committee might be interested in this, we're also starting another programme which has been active in Canada for quite a number of years, and in the UK as well, which is private community sponsorship, where a community would decide we will take a family. So the community come together, sometimes under faith groups, sometimes under community organisations, and they decide we will actually take a refugee family into our community. We will locate a house, we will equip the house and do it up and so forth, and we will support the family when they arrive. Now, I went to Manchester and London to see this in action. I met the people involved in it, and they said they never in their lives were involved in anything which gave them more satisfaction than this. And when the families arrived in, it was great to see the children running up onto the laps of their new grannies, if you will, and the bond that had already been made. So that's something that I'm very anxious to pursue here as another method of actually welcoming and integrating refugees into Ireland. So what happens then is when they come off the plane, they go directly to the community. And there's no Iraqs or no in-between reception involved. It all happens in the community. So if deputies were interested, or senators, in actually promoting that in your own communities, in your own constituencies, and leading it, I'd be very interested in working with colleagues and supporting that.
It's just a comment really, and I think the Minister is correct to highlight the positive benefits that come to communities by a positive approach being adopted, and particularly when there are some worrying signs of developments in Ireland of a growth of racism and certain elements fueling issues of hatred around direct provision and that kind of thing. But isn't it as well a lesson on, like when the Syrians came in here into the likes of Monasterevin, the treatment and the resettlement and the attention given to precisely those issues, to integration, to English lessons, to acclimatising to a completely new, different culture, worked and prepared those people to go into communities and be part of them and feel wanted and part, and contrast that then with the direct provision scenario and how those people are completely isolated, and now many of them have their status and are stuck there and they can't get out and they're still not accessing the labour market. It's a lesson in how not to do it, and I think now that we have these extra money, we've got to be spending it on the positive, and some of those people in direct provision have to be getting it, I think, to get out. But that's maybe a separate argument. But you know, I know tomorrow we'll take up the fact that you've loads of money to implement the family reunification bill, so that's great.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. The next speaker is Deputy Jack Chambers, to be followed by Deputy Donegal O'Leary.
Thanks, Chair. I'm conscious of time as well, but thank the Minister for coming in. Just a couple of technical questions about the 4 million. Can you give a breakdown of whether does it relate to this year, or is it accrued from previous years as well? And has it any effect on your allocations for future years? So I know, obviously, with various budgetary estimates, when money continues to roll over, it can affect the future budgetary projections, but maybe you can just clarify that, because I think, as Deputy Daly said, it's important that we, you know, this is as an added contribution to communities. And just on a secondary point, we've obviously had an underbelly of comment in Ireland in recent months. Whilst I said at a national level, all parties and politicians have been very responsible around commentary around migration, and it's very welcome. But we have had an underbelly of commentary that's definitely worrying. And I suppose, what's your department doing to try and address that? I know the Canadian model, I know from speaking to people in Canada, kind of a decentralised model where you kind of a buddy system with families has worked well there, as you mentioned, and has helped to integrate a lot of families. But I suppose, just on a broader sense, maybe how can we look at, say, some of the 4 million of trying to ensure that we don't see the pattern that's emerged in other countries developing in Ireland? And I'm glad that the body politic has actually been responsible and have been above some of the negative stuff we've seen. So thanks again for coming in.
Yeah. Minister, thanks, Chairman. Again, thanks, Deputy, for those questions there. Yeah, on the second part, we're actively working the migrant integration strategy, and I would invite senators and deputies to, maybe, if you haven't done so already, to read that and look at it. It's a living document, and if members have suggestions as to how we can add to it or improve it, I'd welcome those as well. That migrant integration strategy is about integration. It includes anti-racism. There's a whole range of actions in there, which is aimed at precisely what the Deputy is alluding to. We work I chair a working group and oversees this work of this, which includes most government departments involved, plus NGOs. And we work very closely with all the NGO groups as well, and they're at the table. And as we know, they're at the coalface dealing with all the issues. And I've told them that my door is open to them. If they have an issue, I want to know first. And if there's any issue out there they want to bring to my attention, I've invited them to bring it to my attention immediately on any of the issues to do with migration. We'll deal with it and sort it out as best we can, as soon as we can, and that. So that's the migrant integration strategy, which I think it takes into account all the issues that the Deputy has mentioned there. With respect to the 4 million, yeah, it's accrued from previous years. The 52 million we have, 0.6 million that for 2014 to 2020 is allocated. That's the lifetime of the programme, and we will lose this funding if we don't actually go through this process now, the 4.1 million that's there, 4.1 million, we lose that. So this is why this is so important that we actually don't lose that, and with the time is actually quite tight. Now we have 3 months because the end of the year is so close, we have a lot less time to get it done. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Deputy Chambers. Deputy Donegal Leary, please.
Thanks. I suppose that I'm, like the other speaker, is conscious of we have other matters on the agenda, so I suppose, look, I mean, I suppose Deputy Daly, I think, is fairly articulately outlined. It's the view I would share, the deep flaws that exist with EU policy as a whole in terms of migration and integration. And likewise, I would feel that I think while efforts have been made, I think there is much more that we can do to provide refugees and asylum seekers with a home here in Ireland. I don't particularly have any questions. I suppose I appreciate the value of the fund in particular, whatever about the wider policy, the value of the fund, and obviously Ireland should try and draw as much from that as possible. In general, in relation to integration, I just want to identify 2 particular points and then maybe just a question. Not necessarily that these might be appropriate to this fund, but they're things that I think should be considered. I think local authorities have a more significant role to play in the whole area of integration than they're currently playing. Some local authorities are probably more proactive than others, but given that these are the people who are responsible for applying for very often the location of schools and facilities and so on, I think they have a more significant role to play. Just as well, a question I've tabled recently, it hasn't come up as an oral question, I'm hoping that it would, but it hasn't, in relation to their local elections forthcoming next year. Now, I know the Department has done work in relation to new Irish communities, more generally immigrant communities, but by and large, and I attended one of those events, it was a good event, by and large it's focused on those who have status already. There are those who are in direct provision, those who are seeking asylum in Ireland are entitled to vote. I think the Department should be more proactive in informing those in direct provision of their entitlement to vote and of facilitating engagement with candidates and councillors. I think things like that are invaluable to ensuring integration in our democracy. So I would encourage that, not just focusing on those who already have status, but those who are in direct provision and informing them of that. And then I suppose just a question. This fund runs up to 2020, I presume, like most European programmes. The process of beginning a new fund to succeed it, I presume, has probably already started. So are we likely to see a proposal for a new fund coming before us in the next year or so?
Minister.
Okay, yeah, again, thanks Deputy O'Leary for his questions and actually for his continued interest and support on this matter. It's really appreciated by the migrants as well, and all the colleagues too. With respect to local authorities, yes, in the last 2 weeks we invited all local authorities to come to a seminar where we address many of the issues as to how they can actually help and get involved and support migrants even more than they're doing. So that seminar happened, I think, in Athlone about 2 weeks ago, and I addressed it as well, and it was quite a good seminar. So we are working with the local authorities, and the Deputy is right, they have a huge role to play here. And they do a lot of work in this area, and we hope to actually, again, we will be working with them to actually increase that and improve that over time. So we had a seminar on, so the Deputy is very timely in his question. We had a seminar very recently with all the local authorities on these matters. With regard to the local elections, again, the Deputy is quite right. We've had a number of meetings around the country where we try to encourage and support and inform migrants of their right to vote, and they all can at local elections, as we know. We also have documentation in the various accommodation centres, and we encourage people migrants as well, to get involved in politics, either to support candidates or to be candidates themselves, and to be aware of what's happening in the political process and to learn about it. So we're doing the best we can in that regard. I recall the PQ, and certainly there's no problem with engagement, of course, between candidates in local elections or any election and people in various accommodation centres. We would encourage that. We have to be aware, of course, that these accommodation centres are homes for people as well, and that there are children living there. So, you know, there's there are kind of safety aspects, but in the communal areas, there's no difficulty in people leaving literature and so on, and obviously meeting with asylum seekers or refugees either, there's no difficulty there. We would encourage that, we're supporting that as best we can. A new fund, yes, a new fund is long-term integration, to prepare a new social fund for 2020 to 2027. They'll be all working together, and they'll be, so
short-term integration with the asylum fund.
Okay, so the new fund is starting, and we are feeding into that. The debate is ongoing at the moment in that regard.
Thank you. Okay, Deputy Mick Wallace, please.
Thanks. Okay, look, Minister, I don't really know or not, but myself and Deputy Daly, we've been in Syria twice in the last 2 years, and obviously when you go there, the story is very different from what you read in the media here or here on RTE, and in the last 2 years since the government have beaten the jihadists in so many areas, 1.5 million Syrians have returned. Over 1.5 million have returned. And first, I mean, I don't want to go into all the politics of it. Obviously, it was very disappointing that the European governments and the EU played a part in actually funding the jihadists that caused so much of the trouble in the first place. But I'm a bit, I don't understand the rationale behind your position where, like, for example, even when we were in Calais, right, the most unfortunate and poorest of the refugees in Calais were Afghan and Kurd. And it would look to us that they actually need a bit more help than anyone else. And I'm wondering, is there a reason why you've picked out the Syrians and the Eritreans as for your most needed attention and help, rather than other nationalities? And I mean, it's only a matter of time that when we're going to find serious numbers moving from Yemen, where the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet is taking place at the moment, and we're still supping tea with the Saudis. I just wonder, Minister, what is the rationale behind not being a bit more facilitating to these other nationalities?
Okay.
Again, when we made, sorry, Chairman, when we made the pledges at the time, the biggest cohort and the biggest group of people who were in most need were Syrians, and so we made the pledge, and that's what the European Union asked us to do. Now, if we expect the Commission will come to us, the Deputy is probably right, in the near future, and come to other countries as well, seeking pledges for some of the countries that the Deputy has mentioned. So that may very well happen in the future. But at the time, Syria was the place where, you know, in most need, if you will, and the Syrian people that were fleeing in huge numbers were in most need. And obviously there was war in the Eritrean area as well. So that was the reason. They were the biggest cohort of people that were in need at the time. Now, things change, and we may very well see, we would expect to see in the next while, maybe another request from the Commission to look at other areas.
Yeah, and I accept that, yeah, a couple of years ago, of course you have dead right to take in Syrians, but given that over 1.5 million have actually gone back now, and there'll be well over another million go back in the next 18 months, would you not look again at taking in the likes of the Afghans and more of the Kurds?
Yeah, we have to work with the Commission on this, and again, that may very well happen. I can't say whether it will happen now. We would certainly be open to any request or discussion with the Commission on that matter, yes, certainly.
I mean, are you not allowed to make that call yourselves? Does it have to be? I mean, have you been told by the Europeans, oh, just take Syrians and Eritreans for the moment?
Yeah. We can revise our national programme ourselves, yes, and I'll take that viewpoint back to the Minister, certainly.
Right, okay. Just on another issue, Minister, the Minister last week told us that there was 600 in direct provision who have actually got their status but can't get out. Is the government doing anything to actually make it possible for these 600 to get out in terms of actively finding places for them? Listen, we know there's a desperate housing shortage for everybody in Ireland, or for so many anyway, but I mean, it will need proactive play on the government's part to actually get these 600 out in order to improve, not only to make places for others, but to improve the conditions and stop some of the overcrowding that's taking place.
Yeah, the Deputy is correct.
Please.
Sorry, the Deputy is correct in this matter, and we have been working very, very proactively to try and find accommodation for people. There are certain times in the year where families find it better to move. That's at the end of a school session, for instance. They don't like moving people out of school and that. But we have provided funding to the Jesuit Refugee Service, Peter McVerry Trust, under this actual fund we're talking about today. The PATS project is there as well. That's providing asylum seekers in transition with housing and support. Also the South Dublin County Partnership 2-year housing integration programme, and that's a key part of that, is to assist residents who have their status to accept housing supports and to assess housing supports. And they're working with the towers in Clondalkin as well, as we know. And we've also provided funding and working with DePaul Ireland, who provide supports to residents with permission to remain in Hatch Hall and Mosney centres to assist them to secure permanent housing outside of the Department's accommodation portfolio. So we are providing housing to a number of different NGOs who have a lot of experience and in this area to find accommodation for the people that the Deputy has identified. And the Red Cross also has been working with people as well, mainly single people, to provide accommodation for those, and they've been quite successful too. But the Deputy is right, it is a challenge, there's no doubt about that. But we have provided funding to the agencies out there who are on the ground to do what they can to locate housing for the people that the Deputy has mentioned. And we all want these people to move on as quickly as possible. They have status, they have a right to stay in the country, they have the same rights as everyone else here in this room, except they're not citizens, of course, yet. They probably will be in time. And we want them to find accommodation, we want them to find homes, and we're doing the very best we can to do that, and we're providing funding to all these agencies to allow that to happen.
You spoke, Minister, about the idea of people coming in and landing and actually going into the community straight away, which obviously sounds great, and it's good if it happens. But I think we do realise, though, is it not true, though, that we are going to have a need for some form of an entity like direct provision for a long time still? And I mean, the direct provision that we've got was probably never meant to be as permanent as it has become. And is there any thought at government level to actually doing things a bit different, given that there's been so much negative publicity around direct provisions, and they have been found to be lacking in many ways?
Yes, Chairman, the whole issue of the direct provision system has changed a lot in the last number of years. And I'd invite colleagues to have a look at that, at the changes that have been made there. And we continue to invest and to change and to improve and to upgrade. At the moment, we have a fair bit of pressure on, because there's been an increase in the number of people looking for international protection. So we have to try and find accommodation for people. When someone comes into Dublin Airport tonight and says, I want asylum, we're obliged to process that claim, as everyone knows. We're also obliged to ask the person, do you need accommodation? And we're obliged to provide that if they need accommodation. Some people, a small number, can actually stay with friends and relations and are here in Ireland already, and a small number of people do that. But the vast majority can't, and they are guaranteed that night a bed, shower, food, security, medical care, whatever else they need. So that's what they get straight away. Now we have streamlined the application process. Part of the criticisms of the system was that people were too long in the process, and as the Deputy knows, there were 3 different ways people could apply. We've now made a single application procedure to try and speed that up, and that people will have a final decision sooner. We also have the Ombudsman and Ombudsman for Children actually going into the centres now freely anytime they wish, and listening, engaging with people, and they can take complaints and engage with people and tell them how they can make complaints. Both of those independent agencies can and do make recommendations on the complaints they get, and we work very closely with them, and we encourage that and welcome that and are anxious to hear from them. We're also developing a whole new set of standards for the centres as well. That's in train at the moment with the NGO community. They have a big impact into the input into that. So we've also put additional staff and resources into Inish to try and speed up the application process as best we can. So a lot has gone on. We have teenage rooms in lots of the centres. We have self-catering in lots of the centres now. So it has changed. But I want to go back for a moment, if I may, Chairman, to the private community sponsorship model, which is something I'm very anxious that communities around the country would actually engage with. And again, if colleagues here are interested in doing that, and if you can activate a community to support a family in that way, we will certainly work with you. And the idea is that somebody would come from the airport and go directly to the community. That's what I saw in operation in Canada and in the UK. With respect to the actual direct provision itself, it has been criticised over the years. People have likened it to open prisons and so on, which I think is most unfair. The actual people there can come and go as they wish. There's no one incarcerated at all or anything like that. There's no signing in or signing out, for instance. The staff are trained in the centres. And I say again, if colleagues have another model that they're aware of anywhere else that works better, tell me what it is. Come and see me. Come and see me or send to me in writing details of what a better system is and how a better system would work. And bearing in mind the constraints we have at the moment, and bearing in mind that, as I said, everyone who arrives into Ireland looking for asylum, seeking asylum, is guaranteed accommodation that night.
You said there was no signing in or out, and that they could come and go. I mean, I know a refugee that was in Waterford, and he was actually studying in Dublin, and he got thrown out of the place in Waterford for not being there enough nights of the week. That's the truth.
Well, I would be very interested if the deputy would like to send me a note on that in writing with the details.
Will. Yeah.
And again, if any other deputies have instances of that, we would certainly be anxious to learn about them and to investigate them and look into them and see what's behind it and support and assist if we can. And it may very well be that there are 2 sides to every story. So let's see what's going on here.
Yeah, I'll write that to you. In general, Minister, I think we're well aware of the fact that there's been a bit of a clampdown in Europe, and rather than facilitating refugees, they're putting up more fences and borders to prevent them getting in. And you might have heard, I don't know if you were aware of the defence questions 2 weeks ago, when Minister Paul Kehoe admitted that the Irish mission in the Mediterranean of last number of months has been a military one rather than a rescue one. Now, while we have been doing some wonderful work down there in the early years, the last boat came home without saving anyone's life, and he admitted for the first time, despite denying it earlier in the year, and Minister Coveney denied it, but Minister Kehoe admitted 2 weeks ago that this was a military mission. What in God's name are we doing involved in the military mission, preventing refugees crossing the Mediterranean and sending them back to be into absolute misery in Libya?
Again, Chairman, this is going outside my remit, I'm afraid. If we were talking about the Defence Forces, maybe Minister Keogh would come here and discuss that with you. But I know that the Defence Forces, the Navy, have done enormous work in the Mediterranean, have saved many, many lives. Thousands and thousands of people have been taken out by our defence, by our naval service. And I've met some of the personnel involved, and some of what they have been through has been life-changing for them as well. I'm also, I think, and maybe I'm not sure if but I'm also aware, of course, that there is people are being exploited by traffickers and so on in the Mediterranean, and there's a role there as well to deal with that. that there is a lot of exploitation going on and people are being trafficked and so on as well. So, but again, that's outside what we're talking about today, which is what we do with this funding when we have it, and actually the important issue of actually drawing it down and looking after the people that actually come here and working on integration and the various integration models that we're working towards, and also the migrant integration strategy as well, which we're working on.
Well, it should also be added that an awful lot of the refugees that are in Ireland came here. They were facilitated by smugglers as well. We have met a lot of them anyway. But just, Minister, just one last point. I know you couldn't reach a deal with the Italians. As a matter of interest, I mean, was the Italian argument? Well, they obviously had a problem with the Gardaí on Italian soil vetting migrants. But was there an element of them, of you coming along, for the Italians not to want states to come along and cherry pick those that were in the camps that had just come in off the Mediterranean in the south of Italy, and they've been left with people then that were considered probably maybe more troublesome or difficult? Or what was the rationale of the Italians?
I don't know. As I say, my understanding is that they didn't want to have what they would call extraterritorial security services operating on their territory. Now, we wanted to do this in a very, very quiet way, if you will. The Gardaí wouldn't be in uniform, and it would mean that we could carry out security checks just to ensure, like we did in Greece, for instance. It worked very well there, and Lebanon. It works very well there. So it was the same process we wanted to so that, you know, if I could come in here then and answer questions and say, yes, the Gardaí were involved in a very, what's the word, but it wasn't very intrusive security check on people, just to see if they could, if there was somebody there that shouldn't come here because of being involved in terrorism or something else. We wanted that's what goes on. So the Gardaí do that. There's no issue of cherry picking in any way. We would be working with the people on the ground out there, as happened in Greece and Lebanon, and that didn't arise. It would be the same process in Italy as in Greece and Lebanon, and that worked. And that worked pretty well.
Thank you.
Okay, Deputy Wallace. Senator Martin Conway, please.
Briefly, Chairman and Minister, you're welcome back to the Justice Committee. And you may recall when you were Chairperson, we went to Portugal to see how they dealt with reception centres in Portugal. And back then, in whatever it was, 2013, 2014, direct provision in this country was a whole different story than what it is today. I would actually suggest today that some of our reception centres would compete favourably with what we saw in Portugal back then. And, you know, I think the engagement with the NGOs certainly has borne fruit. And I think we're in a situation now where there's probably little that any NGO can suggest that should be done that's not been done. And on that, I suppose there's always going to be challenges. And we saw a situation down in Mealich, just outside Limerick, which is in my constituency, where there was an issue where somebody couldn't get a cup of tea or something. And I have to say that as soon as it was brought to the attention of RIA, it was dealt with very quickly. And there are going to be instances where things happen. And you're dealing with a situation where we've a number of reception centres, and you're dealing with people. And I think it's commendable that when something is brought to your attention, that it is dealt with. And I would encourage everybody who has specific stories that aren't appropriate or shouldn't be happening, that they would bring it to your attention. Just on the McMahon report, Minister, is there further recommendations of the McMahon report to be implemented? Is there an implementation plan remaining, or are you satisfied at this stage that as much of the McMahon report has been implemented that's going to be implemented?
Thank you, Senator. Minister, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Senator. Yeah, definitely I agree that the accommodation centres have improved quite a bit. We're always striving and exploring new ways of further improving the centres. opening creches, for instance, for children, or opening creches in the locality that children of the locality can use and children of the living in the centres can use, and that facilitates integration as well. Funding various sporting bodies, again, where they include asylum seekers from the centres in sport. And that, we've seen that, in fact, I think one of them got an award last year. Ballahadreen, for instance, GA got an award for the work they're doing, and there are other clubs and sporting organisations around the country doing a huge amount of that. Over 3,000 people in the accommodation centres now prepare and cook their own meals in either their own accommodation or communal kitchens. The implementation of this recommendation will continue until it's complete, so we're rolling that out, and it's a prerequisite of all new contracts to be awarded under the process that happens. The standards then, as I said, we're developing a whole new set of standards here, and a draft has been prepared and a public consultation is currently underway. The standards will apply to all centres under contract to the Minister, and we also have, just as a matter of interest, as you have a Learning for Life programme, and they have the Open Doors project, which we're supporting to encourage and support asylum seekers and refugees to get work and get jobs. Obviously, the right to work is there, and we're working to try and see how we can link up employers with asylum seekers that now have a right to work as well. So yes, there's a lot going on. We haven't quite finalised all the McMahon report yet, but recommendations yet, but we're, I think, 95% of the way there, you could say. But we continue to explore and look for new ways of improving matters. And I think the big two issues is shortening the amount of time it takes to make a decision, get to a final decision, and also then, as I think Deputy Wallace said earlier on, trying to facilitate people and support people once they have a status to move on into the community and carry on with their lives and support them in that way as well.
Okay. Would the Minister, just in terms of, like, look, it is a fact of life now that people are going to come to our country seeking international protection because our economy is improving and we're seen as a nation that does care, and rightly so. Would the Minister or his people consider that the state should be running these direct provision centres or reception centres themselves, as opposed to contracts with private citizens now, or with private companies? Now, I know it might be somewhat in the long term, but is there a thinking within the department or within government that we should be building purpose-built reception centres and running them ourselves, or at least owning them and entering a service level agreement with an organisation to run them, where we have more control, there's certainty. It's not just a yearly contract. At the end of that year, the owner of the facility could just decide, I'm not going to renew it, and then we're in a situation where there's a couple of hundred people in the street, that it would just bring certainty that, in other words, we own the facilities and we have more control, and we have more control over the standards then, and what happens going forward.
Minister.
Yeah, again, there are a few issues that arise here. First of all, you can get times when you have a lot of people in the protection system looking for protection, and other times it can go down. So we don't want to be in a situation where we have centres that are closed and that we don't need. There is a flexibility involved in what we are doing at the moment, but I take the point of the Deputy, of the Senator, sorry, that it would be, and it's something we are exploring. How can we use state-owned facilities and augment those to provide more accommodation and better accommodation for asylum seekers? And that's something that we are exploring, certainly. But the way it's done at the moment is by competitive tender, and it's quite competitive. We're obviously very anxious to get value for money for the state as well, that it doesn't cost too much, and at the same time we make sure the standards are high. So that's the challenge that we have to do. So I suppose the big one we're watching is standards all the time, to make sure the standards are as high as we can get them in the centres, and to make sure that, as I said earlier on, that somebody who's looking for international protection has accommodation, and that they won't end up on the streets, as happened in the past, in the 90s, when people came to Ireland, looked for asylum, and ended up on the streets. And that's not happening at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I think the story is improving. It's never ideal, but the story certainly is improving, and I think the self-catering element that you're beginning to insist on is absolutely welcome, because I think that type of autonomy for people in centres is extremely important for their mental well-being as well as everything else. So, of course, thanks, Minister, and keep up the good work. And perhaps maybe in the new year, in a few months' time, you might come back and give us a further update.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Just my own behalf, Minister, last week we had the lead minister in your department in relation to the supplementary estimate. And he indicated to us that there were 6 new accommodation centres opened in the course of 2018, this year so far, accommodating a number of the order of some 567 persons, as I recall. Now, he named the 6 centres, and members were particularly interested in the locations concerned. But I asked him, and you've just indicated there, you know, tendering. Is there another methodology being employed where individual business people are block booking accommodation in hotels that are not functioning to capacity and are directly involved in accommodating large numbers of people across a network of small to medium-sized hotels at different locations across the country? Have you anything to add to what Minister Flanagan? Minister Flanagan had nothing to tell us, I have to say, but I would expect, as you're the line minister in relation to this particular matter, that you might be in a position to shed some light on it.
Yeah, I answered a PQ on this last week, actually, and I can get the information, and I will get the information to you, Chairman, from that parliamentary question. And the Chairman is correct. At times, and as our big concern is that people seeking international protection do not end up on the street. So, and as we all know, there is a lot of pressure at the moment on the accommodation centres that are under contract. There have been times when they've been virtually full. And at that time, rather than having somebody having no particular place to go, people can be offered accommodation in hotels on a B&B basis, bed and breakfast basis, so they won't be on the street. And that has happened. Now I can get you the actual figures, the up-to-date figures, and I'll do that. I'll get that done today.
Well, I'd appreciate that,
yeah.
And as chair of the committee, I will circulate the information to my colleagues on this committee. I know that most of them were not aware of what I was actually focusing in on here last week. But, you know, we're not talking about small numbers. In one particular hotel, we're talking about almost up to 80 people, you know, which I visited personally. And, you know, I'm deeply concerned. I mean, Senator Conway says matters improving. I don't see it when we are moving to this methodology of address of the issue. People are seeing business opportunities here, and the motivation, I have to say, is questionable. And, you know, the suitability factor is very, very questionable. Minister, hotels may offer a bed night situation that's comfortable, but the location might be absolutely and wholly inappropriate and unsuitable because it's either remote or, in tandem with that, there's no public transport. There is an isolation factor. There are no opportunities, no outlets, no opportunities to develop oneself, to follow up on natural exercise and pastime, etc. I'm deeply, deeply concerned about it, and in replying to us, would you please incorporate the expected or mean time frame for the utilisation of these facilities? identify their location. And I have to add that from what I have personally noted, you know, you talked earlier in inviting communities to, you know, either through elected representatives or by their own initiative to come forward. But in these instances, there's no community consultation whatsoever. And so there's no community involvement, there's no invitation even to extend the hand of welcome, friendship, and all of that, which is hugely important. And nothing will secure the wrong reaction than totally ignoring a community. I think it's guaranteed that you will get negative reaction as a consequence, where properly moulded consultation, laying out exactly what's proposed and seeking community involvement will deliver a much better response. If there's anything further you'd like to add,
Thanks,
Minister,
Chairman.
please.
Yes, I actually have the figures for you here, Chairman, so I can give them to you now. As of the 2nd of December 2018, there were 184 people seeking international protection in emergency accommodation beds. Now, the intention there would be that these beds would be for a very short period, maybe 1 or 2 nights, before we can actually locate them and offer them accommodation in one of the other more permanent centres. Rather than having people on the street when all the other centres are full, we guarantee that they will not be without accommodation, without food, and so on. So the number is 184. With respect to location, and again, getting back to what the Chairman just mentioned there about the about community consultation. The RIA does not go out and earmark or pick a hotel or a centre. RIA and the department put out a call for expressions of interest. So that can come from anywhere. When that happens, the staff go and inspect it to make sure it's up to standard. So if the chairman had an accommodation centre somewhere and he was interested in, Chairman, if you were interested in making it available, and you contact the department, is the suggestion that at that stage the department should tell everybody else that this particular business person has contacted the department to make his premises available. Now so the department go and inspect it, and sometimes it may not be suitable at all, and it will be said, no, it's not, it won't do, we won't take it on. Then it may be deemed, yes, it has all the features required, and it's up to standard. At that stage, should the actual community be involved? That's the question. The next thing happens then is the businessman or the owner of the facility will sit down and he'll start working out a contract in terms. And sometimes they come to an agreement, sometimes they won't. If they come to an agreement and they shake hands and yes, we can do business now on these terms, that's when it's made public. Now, I would contend that prior to that happening, it could very well be, and it can happen, that no agreement is reached. And I can't see how you can involve the public in consultation until you know that you're going to make an agreement. And the minute that's made, people are involved. And the experience around the country is that the local people, yes, are concerned and they have questions, and the very best is done to answer those questions and meet those concerns. The experience in all the 37 or 38 accommodation centres is good in the communities that are up and running. Friends of the Centre under McMahon, it was recommended that Friends of the Centre would be established, and that's done immediately and funded and supported by the department and as well and by RIA. And we find that when local people get to know the people in the accommodation centres and get to work with them, that the support is overwhelming. But I would suggest that the consultation, the discussion is done at the earliest possible time that's suitable to do so, and that is when the agreement, when an agreement is reached or on the verge of being reached with the owner. Yes, we will do business. Prior to that, the owner could very easily walk away and say, I'm not going to do business, or indeed the department could walk away and say, we're not doing business. I think it wouldn't be fair on any owner of a property, or indeed in the community, to say we're having a discussion on this. at a very early stage, before you actually make an agreement. So it's a tricky one. And we've had these discussions previously, and I'm sure the Chairman will understand how difficult it is. So if an owner of property contacts the department, is that when we should say, we've been contacted by X, wants to talk to us? You know, but there are also commercial considerations and privacy considerations here for people. So as I say, 184 people at the moment, on the 2nd of December, were in emergency beds who are under national protection. At the same time, there were 5,607 at that time in contracted capacity. I think that's right, is it? Yeah.
Minister, I want to add, and I don't intend to protract the address of this issue, but I have it to say that, you know, the suitability of the accommodation or the conditions is one thing, the acceptance of the circumstances, and the question in relation to the suitability of the location is another. And you have to examine the needs of these people in the round. It's not only that there may be a comfortable bed in a relatively acceptable standard of accommodation. There are a whole lot of other issues. There are language issues. There are all sorts of real problems. And remembering that these people all didn't come in a single tranche. They're coming from a variety of different backgrounds with an inability to communicate even among themselves. There are families among them with children, Minister, and the situation, I believe, is not appropriate. I add this further, what I believe shocking fact. I am told that because it's not direct provision, accommodation, that where an issue arises, that it is the business person who has block booked and acquired the hotel accommodation to allow for these 184 unfortunate people, that's the go-to person. That's the go-to person. Now, I really do ask for a full and detailed response. I have had a PQ reply in relation to a specific case that I put to you. And I expect that you and your colleague are the authors of it, because the Minister last week, quite frankly, knew absolutely Fanny Adams about it, and that's just a fact. He did undertake to come back to me, but a week later I have nothing. And I'm asking you, please, as you've indicated at the start, I would like a detailed reply, considering all of the points that I've made, identifying the locations, and what other salient information that you can furnish to myself as chair of this committee to furnish to my colleagues in turn. And I would appreciate that would be done post-haste, Minister.
Okay, Chairman, just on that, I agree with you fully that location is important, and I would actually love, and I'm sure we all would, to have asylum seekers and those looking for international protection to be accommodated near the city centres, near the centres of large towns. That would be ideal. But unfortunately, when we put out a call for accommodation, when we look for accommodation, we don't get people from the centre of Dublin offering accommodation, or from the centre of Cork, or anywhere else, or other places. So we can't magic up accommodation centres in the centre of Dublin or anywhere else. We have, I can go through all the accommodation centres that we have. Quite a lot of them are in large towns. So I can go through the list and tell you how many were in each one on the 2nd of December, if you wish. The detail I also,
Minister, to the committee, yeah, and to the further guest list that we have waiting for some considerable time outside, sure, I'd ask that you would furnish the detail in writing.
I can do that.
Which I think, circulated to all the members, will be the most valuable aid for each of us in addressing this matter into the future. If there's anyone who would like to add, but very briefly, because we do have, yeah, and it is...
No, you know, I was just going to say, compliment you on your efforts, Chair, and not letting this go and alerting us. There's different things going on here. It's not just the issue of the accommodation centres. It's the very sinister development that our chairman has highlighted now 2 weeks in a row of effective subcontracting and profiteering upon profiteering. And it's really worrying, and I'm shocked, well, I'm not shocked, I would expect it, that you didn't get a response from last week and this week, but it is disgraceful, and just to support that he's speaking for all of us, and we're shocked to have the information, but glad this is beginning to come out in the public domain. So.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. Deputy Wallace.
Yeah, Minister, I can well understand that if you put out a call looking for places, you're not going to get places in the centre of cities and towns just like that. That's understandable, right? But I mean, obviously, just for a fact, the cheapest single room on Gardner Street on Thursday and Friday night this week is €250. €250. But does it not put it up in lights that the state, ye own land, the state owns land in the middle of every city and every town in this country. And, obviously it can't, it's not going to appear overnight, but should that not be direct government involvement in building places? And they could be multi-use, they could be used for other things other than direct provision. They wouldn't be wasted. It makes sense, and while I know it'll take time to deliver, but Rome wasn't built in a day, but God, it was started,
I could just add to that, Minister, I think to demonstrate the cross-party support for what Deputy Wallace has just again referenced, your own colleague Senator Conway made this very point in his earlier contribution. No, Minister, I hope and colleagues will appreciate that I'm very conscious of the time moving on, and we have a list of invited guests to come before us in relation to the Bail Amendment Bill, and I don't wish to leave them waiting any further. So, I want to thank you, Minister Staunton, for your open and frank reply to all of the questions posed, and I would again just say to you, I thank you too in advance of the receipt of the detailed information that I hope you will furnish ASAP, and preferably this week. I mean that sincerely. So in accordance with Standing Order 90 and Standing Order 89.2, the following message will be sent to the Clerk of the Dáil. The Joint Committee on Justice and Equality has completed its consideration of the following option or discretion on the Protocol 21. Quote, proposal for a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council amending Regulation EU number 516 of 2014 of the European Parliament and the Council as regards the recommitment of the remaining amounts committed to support the implementation of the Council decisions EU 2015-1523 and EU 2015-1601, or the allocation thereof to other actions under the national programmes, a copy of which was laid before Dáil Éireann on the 20th of November 2018, unquote. On behalf of the committee, as I've already said, I thank you for your attendance here today and engagement with us, and we shall now suspend for a few minutes to facilitate the Minister's departure and his colleagues and the arrival of our next set of witnesses. Caoimhghín. public session. The purpose of the second part of this morning's engagement is to conduct detailed scrutiny of the Bail Amendment Bill of 2017, sponsored by Deputy Jim O'Callaghan. We are joined by Vice Chairperson, Ms Joan Dean, and from the Irish Penal Reform Trust we are joined by Ms Deirdre Malone, the Executive Director, and Ms Fiona Nikineda, the Deputy Executive Director, and also by Ms Michelle Martin, Senior Research and Policy Project Manager. And from Trinity College Dublin we are joined by Dr Mary Rogan, Associate Professor in Law. You're all very welcome here this morning, and I know that Joan was to be joined by Conor Nolan, but unfortunately he's not able to join us this morning, and we thank him for his initial indication of intent. So you're all very welcome, and I will shortly invite you to make your opening statements in the order in which I announced you. I hope that that's okay. But first of all, I must draw the attention of our witnesses to the situation in relation to privilege. Please note that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name, or in such a way as to make him, her, or it identifiable. So before inviting our first speaker, one of our own colleague members, I just want to remind everybody to please put their mobile phones on silent. If we don't do that, it interferes with the recording equipment, and that's to our visitors as well, please. So the format is that Deputy O'Callaghan will outline his bill first, and our witnesses will then be invited to make their opening statements, whereupon I will open it up to the members to engage with you all accordingly. So I now invite Deputy O'Callaghan to make his opening statement, please.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and thank you all very much for coming in. We appreciate the assistance you're providing to the committee in respect to the job that we have to do. I should just give you a brief overview of the process of this legislation, which is the same as every piece of legislation. It was introduced in Dáil Éireann actually a year ago on the 14th of December 2017. There's no real debate about it when the bill is being introduced. You just 5 minutes introduce it, gets through, and then there's a second stage debate that happened on the 28th of June of this year in Dáil Éireann, when there's a substantive debate about the legislation. Obviously, people don't have to be fully supportive of it to vote for it, but it passed through second stage. A number of individuals raised concerns about it, but concerns are dealt with at committee stage, and in particular they're dealt with when you have a private member's bill at this scrutiny stage. So it's very important for me, it's very important for the committee that you're here and that you're engaging in this process. I always feel it's important to state as well, just because it's my bill, don't feel that you can't trash it or say that you don't agree with it. There's lots of legislation. I can assure you there's lots of legislation that comes from my left over here that we have similar responses to. But I suppose what I want to do at the outset is to try to get some form of agreement on the basis that there is an issue and there is a problem in respect of offences being committed by people who are out on bail. And like all pieces of criminal justice legislation, like I'm of the view, and this committee I know is of the view, that legislation should only be introduced if it's evidence-based, if it's necessary, and if it's going to work. So although we're all politicians, we don't believe in introducing legislation just because they sound good, but they have to be based on evidence. And I suppose the start of this, when you're looking at the evidence basis and the legal basis, we probably have to go back to 22 years ago, because we did have a referendum in December 1996 where the people overwhelmingly voted to change our constitution. And they changed it by putting a provision into Article 40, which stated that provision may be made by law for the refusal of bail by a court to a person charged with a serious offence where it's reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence by that person. So the public changed the law. That's the fundamental document that we have. And then let's look to see, has there been a continuing problem in respect of offences being committed by people who are on bail? Regrettably, it is the case that there is a continuing problem. I've circulated my fellow members of the committee with a page here, and I don't know if some of you may have it in front of you, and I apologise if there aren't enough copies for you. But I did put down a parliamentary question to the Minister for Justice and Equality, which was answered last month. And I asked the extent to which individuals who were out on bail were recorded as being committing a further offence between the years 2013 to 2018. And I've distributed it to my colleagues there, and the Minister set out very concisely in tabular form the different types of offences. He listed 15 different types of offences, and he did it by year: 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016 and 2017. And in respect of each of the offences, you can see that there are recorded crime incidents with at least one suspected offender on bail when they were committed. So, we could go down through these figures. I don't intend to, but could I just ask you maybe to look at number 7, which is burglary and related offences, that you'll see that in 2013 there was 1,241, 2014 1,674, and up to last year 1,342. So, I think there should be no difficulty in this committee accepting that, unfortunately, we do have a problem with crime being committed by people who are out on bail. Now, there may be reasons for that, and that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be further research. Part of the reason could be people think that if they're out on bail, that there's probably no deterrent in committing another offence whilst out on bail, because any sentence for the latter offence is going to run concurrently with the former offence. That may be one of the factors. But I just start my presentation to you by stating that we do have a problem, and there is a responsibility on us as legislators to try to deal with it. Listen, I have an opening statement which I suppose I should read out just for the record of it, but it states, Chairman, that the principal purpose of the bill is to amend the Bail Act 1997. That was the legislation that was introduced in the aftermath of the constitutional amendment. And unfortunately, I have to repeat again that there is evidence of a high rate of offending among people out on bail. In 2017, 12% of all crimes committed were committed by persons who were out on bail for another offence. And what this bill attempts to do is it attempts to make it mandatory for a court to refuse bail if the court is satisfied that such refusal is reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence by that person. At present, it's optional for the court to refuse bail if it thinks that such refusal is reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence. In my opinion, the constitutional amendment is clear, and the obligation should be that if you think it's going to reasonably considered necessary, well then bail should be refused. The legislation also, I suppose, specifically concentrates on the crimes of burglary and aggravated burglary, because they are offences, and I read out the statistics there, they are offences in respect of which there is a high rate of recidivism. We know from the 2013 Irish Prison Service recidivism study that there's a recidivism rate of around 80% amongst persons in prison for burglary and related offences, and this is the highest rate for any offence group and is considerably above the overall recidivism rate of 62%. And we also have these statistics in front of us here from the Central Statistics Office, published under reservation, which indicate there is a problem. I read the submissions all of you put in. I obviously read the one put in by ADVIC, and I know ADVIC's concern in part is that they see that the substantive part of this legislation only applies to burglary and aggravated burglary, and I know, Joan, that it would be your desire to see it apply broader to other serious offences. That's an argument with which I have considerable sympathy, but I suppose doing this on the basis of evidence-based analysis, it is clearly the case from the statistics that burglary and aggravated burglary have a particularly high rate of recidivism. The bill also seeks to introduce a provision in respect of electronic monitoring. Like electronic monitoring, unfortunately, seems to be presented as sort of, if you're in favour of it, you're obviously very draconian. If you're opposed to it, you're obviously very liberal. Unfortunately, this simple analysis of people's views of issues pertaining to bail and indeed alternatives to losing your liberty, I don't think are helpful. Electronic monitoring applies throughout Europe. It applies in Northern Ireland. It applies in lots of countries which have less people in jail than we have in this country. It is there as an option and an alternative to people being incarcerated. In Northern Ireland, we had the Assistant Chief Constable Todd here a couple of weeks ago, and more people from Northern Ireland. They use it up there for applications for bail. And the alternative is, if you don't go for the electronic monitoring, well, then you're going to have the option of being denied bail. So I would have thought any person who was trying to avoid people being subjected to pre-trial detention should recognise that electronic monitoring is an option to prevent them being so incarcerated prior to their trial. And we know that the Irish Prison Service use electronic monitoring to monitor some prisoners, and that there are pilot programmes in respect of it. Listen, the bill is, I've gone through it before, but Section 1 is the standard provision. Section 2A deals with what I said there, to make it mandatory for a court to refuse bail if the court believes it's reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence. Then there's the Section 2B, which substitutes a new provision for subsection 2A, which was inserted into the Act of 97 by the Criminal Justice Burglary of Dwellings Act 2015. And the new section requires the court to refuse an application for bail where an application for bail is made by a person charged with a relevant offence, where the relevant offence is alleged to have been committed in a dwelling and the circumstances specified in 2B are complied with. And obviously a relevant offence in the legislation is aggravated burglary or burglary. Then sections 2C and 2D amend subsection 2B, providing for a broader range of circumstances which will warrant the refusal of bail by the court. Under the provisions of the bill, a person charged with burglary or aggravated burglary will be refused bail if the applicant has a conviction for burglary, aggravated burglary in a dwelling in the previous 5 years, or 2, the applicant has been charged with and waiting trial for at least 2 offences of burglary, aggravated burglary in a dwelling within a period commencing 6 months before and ending 6 months after the offence in respect of which the bail application is being made, or 3, the applicant has a conviction for burglary, aggravated burglary in a dwelling and is awaiting trial for another such offence which is alleged to have occurred within a period commencing 6 months before and ending 6 months after the offence in respect of which the bail application has been made. And then finally, Section 3 deals with the use and provision of electronic monitoring for persons as a condition of bail in certain circumstances. And the section provides that where a person is charged with an offence as provided for in Section 2B, the court will make recognizance subject to the use of an electronic monitoring device. So listen, that's the overview of the bill. I just want you, like sometimes people criticise politicians. Politicians have one great ability in my assessment. They're very much aware of what the public is considering and what are the issues that affect the public. In my opinion, politicians are much more aware of that than journalists and then academics and then lawyers or builders or whatever we all do in different parts of our life. And it has to be emphasised that people are extremely concerned about the fact, and it's a legitimate concern, particularly in respect of burglary and aggravated burglary, that people can apply for bail, be granted bail, and then there's a high rate of them committing further burglaries and aggravated burglaries whilst they're out on bail. I know fully, as a lawyer, that persons who are arrested for offences are not guilty of those offences, that they have to go through a trial process. And I know the academic arguments about the constitutional rights in terms of liberty and the presumption of innocence owned and which are precious to individuals, and I'm conscious of the rights under the Convention of Human Rights. But I'm also conscious of the fact that there is a reality out there that needs to be addressed by legislators, and I fully respect that each of you come from different, I suppose, advocacy groups and different organisations that seek to advocate a certain cause, and I commend you all for doing that, because it's very important that we have different groups advocating on behalf of particular groups, whether or not it's prisoners or victims. But when it comes to politicians, when there's a problem there, we can ignore it or we can seek to deal with it, and I think we need to deal with it because statistically it is clearly a problem. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Deputy O'Caoláin. Now we'll go to our panel, our invited guests, and the first of those will be Ms. Dean to make the opening statement on behalf of ADVIC. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just first a brief word about ADVIC. It's a registered charity and we advocate for victims of homicide, founded in 2005, and it's run entirely by volunteers who themselves have been bereaved by homicide. So today I'm speaking about bail only as it relates to homicide. ADVIC welcomes any attempts to improve our existing bail laws that will ensure fairness for an accused person and victims alike. We wonder if the bill goes far enough, because if we're in a position now to review the current law, we should take the opportunity to ensure that the change is significant and effective. We mustn't forget the family of a victim of homicide when it comes to bail. In every case of homicide, there's a grieving family left behind to try to come to terms with an immense tragedy, while at the same time having to navigate their way through a legal system that is very dense and often alien to them. And we feel the criminal justice system as it stands doesn't really serve the needs of such families at all. We know that bail is a complex issue, and for a bereaved family it can present very real issues and concerns. A person accused of homicide out on bail can and often does prevent very real danger to the family of his or her victim, and this can increase stress and worry and anxiety for a family. The accused may live in close proximity to the family, and very often the accused can even be a family member. In all cases, the stress levels are increased and to such an extent that it becomes a great burden on a family. And indeed, very often there's a very real danger to such a family. ADVIC has worked with families bereaved by homicide since 2005, and the issues and concerns they raised to us over the years include intimidation by an accused, or indeed by his or her family. And this can take many forms. There can be openly aggressive behaviour, or often more subtle but nonetheless very real intimidation, and this can result in re-victimisation. Indeed, there are occasions where a whole community might be affected by the behaviour of a person accused of homicide while out on bail, and the safety of individuals and the wider community must be considered before bail is granted. ADVIC understands that the constitutional right to bail and the presumption of innocence must be upheld, and ADVIC in no way wishes to take away the rights of an accused person, but we strongly feel that the right to protection of the victim or victim's family in the case of homicide must be given equal consideration at the very least. We feel the bill does not sufficiently address the practical issues that affect families of homicide. It's vital that any change to our existing bail laws must be enforceable and resourced if any change is to be effective. ADVIC would propose that where an accused breaches his or her bail, having been charged with an unlawful killing, this in itself must be considered a serious offence, regardless of the nature of the breach. This new offence should not be punished concurrently, but should be treated consecutively. ADVIC further proposes that a person convicted of or pleading guilty to any unlawful killing should not be released on bail while awaiting sentence. It must also be remembered that the time it takes to bring a case to trial creates very real stress and anxiety for families, and any changes to the bail laws should take this into account, because it can increase the time where a family is under threat. We think that electronic monitoring is a very good idea, particularly for the most serious crime of all, but we wonder how it would work, how it would be resourced, and how long would it take to implement. Meanwhile, there are some practical enforceable ways to afford protection to victims' families following a homicide, such as applying strict bail conditions. Perhaps regular blood testing should be a condition of bail where drugs or alcohol are an issue. Revoking a driving licence in some cases may afford some protection. But we very strongly feel that when a senior Garda objects to bail, that this is never done lightly, and it should be given very careful consideration by a judge. But we also believe that the views of the family of the victim and their fears should be taken into account. I really would like to stress that ADVIC has no wish to interfere with the rights of an accused person to bail, but we do, however, feel that the family of a homicide victim is entitled to protection, as is society in general. It's essential that any objection to bail by a senior member of An Garda Síochána is given very serious consideration, at the very least before bail is granted. It's also important that the views of the family are taken into account and their fears or concerns are listened to. If we have this opportunity now to change, we must ensure that any such change will significantly and effectively address the needs of families of homicide victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan, for that very informative and, I have to say, very passionate presentation. I'd now like to invite Deirdre Malone, who is representing the Irish Penal Reform Trust. Deirdre.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Chairman, Deputies and the Senator this morning for the invitation to address you. I think it's important to say at the outset that the commission of offences on bail is rightly a matter of serious concern to the committee and to victims' advocates, who will, of course, have the safety of the community at the forefront of their minds. Our position is that the solution doesn't lie in the introduction of further legislation, which is, in our view, unconstitutional. Pre-trial detention has a really important part to play in some criminal proceedings, but it's very important to have a look at what is already there. And in our view, there's a very robust bail system already in place, which deals with many of the concerns that Deputy Ó Caoláin has raised this morning. In relation to the constitutional issues, I just want to be very clear that the court already has the power to refuse an application for bail under the 97 Act as amended, where the court is satisfied that that refusal is reasonably necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence. Deputy Callahan rightly said that that was introduced in response to the referendum put to the people, and that is absolutely correct. However, what this bill does is makes that decision mandatory, so effectively takes any course of reflection away from the judiciary and makes the decision mandatory. The Deputy said that it is very important that legislation is evidence-based and that it's necessary, and we really welcome that assertion. It's also important that legislation is constitutional and proportionate, and indeed that it's going to work. And that's where we would raise some questions around the introduction of this particular provision. The provisions essentially oblige the court to refuse bail in the circumstances set out, and that precludes the court from considering other relevant factors, for example, the seriousness of the immediate charge that's before the court, the strength of the evidence in the particular case, any previous convictions, the personal circumstances of the accused, and crucially, the length of time it will take for the charge to go to trial, which in this jurisdiction can be lengthy. We would support the position of the Irish Human Rights Commission that observed that the refusal of a bail application is a responsibility that rests under law with the judiciary alone, and it's for that reason and the further reasons set out in the submission that it's our view that this particular provision, because of its mandatory nature, is unconstitutional in all the circumstances. In relation to the issue of electronic monitoring, again, I think it's very important to be clear that there is already legislative provision for electronic monitoring as a condition of bail. What this bill does is makes it mandatory to impose electronic monitoring where a person applies who satisfies the relevant criteria that's set out in the legislation. There's two issues with that. One, it doesn't meet the proportionality test at all, and as such is in breach of Article 5. And secondly, it misunderstands the way that electronic monitoring operates and what it can actually deliver in practice. All of us have a concern in delivering a safer community to your constituents and to your colleagues, but there is a misunderstanding of what electronic monitoring can actually deliver. The court is obliged under the Constitution and under the European Convention of Human Rights to restrict the right to liberty to the minimum extent necessary to achieve the legitimate aim. That doesn't mean that electronic monitoring should not be, in some cases, imposed by the court. The court has the power to do that and can do that. But if you preclude the court from considering any other alternative in all circumstances, in our view, that falls foul of the proportionality test and is in breach of Article 5. The other issue is about what can electronic monitoring deliver. And Certainly research from the UK, and I think certainly Professor Rogan will speak further on this, highlights real difficulties with electronic monitoring in terms of inaccuracies in the data that's returned. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't prevent a crime being committed by that person. What it does is it tells you at a particular time where a person might be. It requires significant Garda resources to actually make it effective in any way in terms of geographical location. We would all like there to be a simple legislative provision that will reduce offending on bail. Everybody would like to see offending on bail reduced. There's no debate around that. But it is a misunderstanding to suggest that electronic monitoring imposed as a mandatory condition can deliver that. We've also set out how the particular provision does not consider at all the recommendations of the Council of Europe that have been made public in 2014. In saying all of that, I don't want in any way to suggest that IPRT is minimising or making trivial the idea of the number of offences on bail. These are high numbers and need to be looked at very carefully. But the solutions may lie in places that we are not considering at all in this committee or in legislation in relation to Garda resourcing, in relation to the capacity available to our Gardaí, in relation to bail supports and services, which are not touched on in any of these debates, in relation to ensuring that pro forma bail conditions are not being handed out and diluting the effective bail conditions when they're being imposed. So certainly the right to liberty and privacy is extremely important. It's very important that the court has the option of refusing bail where that is constitutionally appropriate. It's important that the court has the option to impose electronic monitoring where that is seen as appropriate. But introducing mandatory provisions in this way is not constitutional and will not deliver what the Deputy wishes it to deliver, what we would all like to deliver, which is a safer community. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Deirdre, on behalf of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. And the last of our opening statements will be delivered by Dr. Mary Rogan. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairperson and members of the committee, I thank the committee for the invitation to speak to you today on the topic of bail and the use of pre-trial detention as part of discussions on the Bail Amendment Bill 2017 sponsored by Deputy O'Caoláin. In this opening statement, I will provide an overview of a research project I undertook as part of a study of the use of pre-trial detention and bail in Ireland and 6 other European countries, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands and Romania. The project is called Towards Pretrial Detention as Ultima Ratio, or DTOR, and it was funded by the European Commission. I would like to share with the committee some of the outcomes of our research which are most relevant to the committee's deliberations under 3 headings. Firstly, the use of pretrial detention in Ireland generally and the European context. Secondly, observations on the risk of offending as a ground for pretrial detention. And thirdly, some reflections on the use of electronic monitoring. The rate of pretrial detention in Ireland at present stands at around 14 detainees per 100,000 population. Ireland's rates of pretrial detention are lower than in the other 6 countries which formed part of our study. The most recent figures which can be compared indicate, for example, that our rate of pretrial detention to the number of pretrial detainees per 100,000 of the population is about half that of the Netherlands, Belgium and Austria. The Irish rate is comparable to the rate found in Germany. The numbers of people in pretrial detention in Ireland have, however, shown a marked rise over the last 2 years. For example, in January 2015, the average number of people in pretrial detention was just under 500. In October of this year, it was 725. This rise is especially notable, though the overall numbers are smaller amongst women, where we see the numbers going from 14 to 39. It's not possible to say at present what the precise reasons for this increase are. The committee will be aware, however, that there have been recent changes to legislation affecting pretrial detention which sought to limit the possibility of a person taking up bail in circumstances where a risk of offending while on bail is at issue. It's notable and regrettable that we cannot say more about the reasons behind these changes. The information we have from the court service is not adequate for public policy making or research purposes. Pre-assessment of the effects of legislation on the numbers in prison and on other sanctions has been recommended by the Penal Policy Review Group, and members might note that no such formal assessments have been completed since that recommendation was made in 2014. On this point then, members of the committee might also note that were the upward trend in the numbers of people in pre-trial detention to continue to increase, Ireland would be going against the trend at the European Union level, which seeks to reduce the numbers of people in pre-trial detention and to use alternatives wherever possible. It is also important to recall that debates on pre-trial detention tend to revolve around the binary distinction between liberty and detention. We must not forget that bail is not liberty simpliciter. The decision before a court is, in the vast majority of cases, between pre-trial detention and gradations or levels of liberty. There is a wide variety of possible conditions which can be imposed on a person as an alternative to pre-trial detention. The question of the monitoring of them and the supports in place to ensure compliance certainly needs to be considered. The emphasis in the bill on the risk of offending as a ground for pre-trial detention raises some interesting issues which our research findings address. Our participants reported that the O'Caoláin grounds, the risk of flight and risk of interference with witnesses, remain the dominant consideration in bail applications in Ireland. It was a notable conclusion of the authors of the comparative report we produced that countries focusing on preventive aspects in their pre-trial detention practice seem to have rather high rates of pre-trial detention. This raises a strong concern that increasing use of the risk of offending ground is likely to lead to higher rates of pre-trial detention. Careful consideration must be given, it is submitted, to what the purposes of electronic monitoring in the Irish context are to be. The experience of other jurisdictions is instructive, and I respectfully recommend that advice be sought on that experience. For example, our European colleagues in this study found that of the 7 countries involved, Belgium and the Netherlands use electronic monitoring most frequently. These are also countries with rates of pre-trial detention almost double ours. There are also many technical matters which need to be considered. Again, an impact assessment should be carried out. There were mixed feelings amongst the Irish participants as to whether the availability of electronic tagging would be a useful development. Some felt that it might give judges more confidence to impose restrictions on movement, and they would therefore be more likely to grant bail. Other participants said there should be an emphasis on the reasons behind why people do not turn up for trial or offend on bail, such as addiction problems, rather than investing in an electronic tag. As one probation practitioner said, it's about what's going on in people's heads. A particularly interesting perspective which emerged concerned the idea that defendants might seek electronic monitoring as an alternative to pre-trial detention and review or appeal an outcome where pre-trial detention was ordered and electronic monitoring was not used. A common view expressed by participants in Ireland was that electronic tagging would be quite similar to the curfew and mobile phone conditions which are frequently imposed as conditions of bail by the Irish courts at present. So it is respectfully recommended that, first of all, the court service be asked to provide figures on the number of bail applications made, granted and refused at district court and high court level on a consistent basis and broken down by offence type. Analysis be undertaken of the trends developing in the use of pre-trial detention in Ireland. An assessment be made of the implications of this bill in terms of prison numbers and the overall cost. An assessment be made of the logistical requirements for electronic monitoring and methods used along with likely cost, and that evidence be sought from those administering systems of electronic monitoring in other jurisdictions, such as Belgium and the Netherlands. And I thank the committee for the opportunity to discuss these matters and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rogan, and we'll now open it up to our members of the Justice and Equality Committee. I have only one indication at the moment, Deputy Donegal O'Leary, Deputy Daly and Deputy Chambers. Donegal, please.
Chair, and to thank all the speakers for coming in. It's much appreciated. And to thank Deputy O'Caoláin for the opportunity to address this issue. When we discussed this in the summer, I remember reflecting upon, I think it was the week that the quarterly crime statistics were published, and it saw a very significant increase in a number of heads and very significant rises, burglaries, thefts, areas like that. And a lot of the discussion was about the level of crime that happens while people are out on bail. So I think that there is a significant issue there, and we should seek to address it. Whether or not this is the right means to do so, I suppose I'll return to that. But there is undoubtedly an issue, and I think as legislators we should strive to try and find a resolution to the number of crimes that are committed by people who are on bail. I suppose before I have a number of points there in relation to electronic tagging and in relation to bail more generally, but if I might ask Ms. Dean, I suppose just yourself specifically, you raised in a general sense the point of that there aren't enough practical measures there to support those bereaved by homicide. Could you elaborate on that? Like, I mean, are there other things that you think we as a committee should be looking at?
Well, I think the first thing is when a Garda objects to bail in the first place, that needs to be given more consideration by a judge, I think. And I also think for that reason we would prefer that judicial discretion was retained by a judge rather than a mandatory imposition of conditions. A judge is hearing the evidence in court. They hear the Garda evidence. A senior Garda is very unlikely to object to bail for no good reason. They have the information, they have all of the facts of the case, they've investigated the case up to that point. And equally, the family and the fears of a family, which are very real and can be extremely stressful, they need to be listened to and they need to be taken into account.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd agree with much what you say, and I would have a general sense that I think judicial discretion is important, and I believe it should be retained. In relation to the legislation such as it is in Section 2, like, I mean, I had the view at committee stage that paragraphs C and D would, read on their own, expand the circumstances in which a judge could refuse bail, and I think that may be worth consideration. But obviously, as it's currently formed, because of paragraphs Section 1 and paragraphs A and B, that would make it an imperative, which I suppose might change my consideration of that. I would also be somewhat cautious there in relation to Section 2B A, and if my understanding this is correctly, and I didn't raise this at second stage, but it's possible under the provisions as it's currently worded, if somebody is charged with 2 relevant offences and facing another relevant offence, that they could be refused bail without actually, in fact, being convicted of an offence. And I think it would be far beyond existing practice if people could be refused bail without ever having been convicted. So if Deputy Caoláin can clarify that, but that's my reading of it at the minute, is that there is, if somebody has been charged with 2 relevant offences and then is facing another further charge, that they can then be refused bail. I do think there is a difficulty as well in relation to how mandatory is, I suppose, the word that has been used. There is, to some extent, a safeguard, and I might return to that in my final question, but like, I mean, I think that is the general intent of this, that makes it as good as automatic. I suppose in relation to bail, my own view of it is that, like, the solution to this lies in supervision and in pursuit of breach of bail. There are countless instances, and it's been detailed in Prime Times Investigates and so on, the frequency at which people who have breached their conditions of bail have committed crimes, and that very often the fact that their bail might have been breached and that their bail could be suspended then on account of that we need much stronger structures, we need much stronger resourcing to ensure that breaches of bail are pursued. Like, I came across a PQ there. I think there were 9,000 examples or so. I think bench warrants executed for breaches of bail in 2017. So I suppose to ask any of the speakers to offer a comment on that. What more can be done by either the Gardaí or any other statutory body to ensure that where bail is breached, that breach is then pursued.
Okay, we'll offer that first, but then I'll go back to Deputy O'Caoláin in relation to the first part of Deputy O'Leary's questioning. Who would like to take up on that? Deirdre? Oh, sorry, Joan, I beg your pardon. Please.
No, I just feel that in the first place, any breach of bail, as I said earlier, has to be considered as a serious offence. And I think the first thing to be done was that needs to be recorded and it needs to be shared. I think there are instances where data is not being shared between different regions. So somebody might commit an offence here and go to another county and commit it, and they're not aware of the breach of bail. So I think recording data and sharing data would be vitally important.
And I suppose just on a cross-border basis too.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't that
Absolutely.
be worth adding to that? Deirdre, please.
I think, thank the Deputy for his comment. I think there's two ways that it could be addressed. First, we did some research back in 2016 and had someone sitting in court and listening, and they found that bail conditions had been attached in every single case that they observed. I think it was around 90 cases. One way of looking at it is ensuring that the conditions that are imposed, where they're imposed, are actually necessary and tailored to the particular case. So the judiciary in the exercise of their function should be looking at what specific risk, if any, has been identified and what is the sensible response to that risk. And I know that the Act that was introduced last year in relation to the Criminal Justice Act specifically made provision for prohibiting or allowing a condition that prohibited contact with the alleged victim themselves or their family. Also allowed for the imposition of curfews, prohibition from driving if charges were for a serious road traffic offence in that case. So ensuring that the conditions are tailored and not pro forma conditions that are being thrown out in every single case, which are impossible for Gardaí to deal with and monitor if they're being handed out in a blanket way. The second is obviously in terms of there's very good examples internationally in terms of bail support and supervision schemes, providing bail hostels so people have a residence that they can name, and basically using very kind of practical measures to ensure people turn up for court, the court time is not wasted, and that the right people are turning up at the right time. And where there are instances where clearly the test is met, so there is a clear flight risk or there is a clear evidence risk of interference with the family, that the bail refusal is an option for the court, and it is an option for the court at the moment and can be used. But if these provisions are not used in a tailored way and conditions are not attached in a tailored way, and Gardaí are not resourced to monitor conditions, then the system will freeze up and won't work. So it has to be a very tailored approach to these things, but there's lots of international examples of ways, and indeed Irish examples in terms of Exeter and have a bail support scheme. This is for under 18s, which is very successful and has worked very well in ensuring people turn up at court, answer their charges, and those cases are progressed. And I think that's something that perhaps the committee could look at in considering how that could be extended to the adult population as well.
Just before going on to Mary, if Fiona and Michelle want to come in at any time, we won't censor you because the IPRT are getting 3 bites at it. But so, Michelle, you'd like to, before I go on?
Just follow up on Deirdre's point, I suppose, just looking at it from a social justice perspective. And, you know, there's been statistics that 70% of adults in prison have addiction issues, 85% for women. We need to look at what access they have to residential drug treatment programmes in the country, to look at issues around homelessness, accommodation, mental health needs, and really like whether actually provision should be around bail supports for adults. As Deirdre said, there's a pilot bail supervision scheme for young people run by Extern, and that's based on multi-systemic therapy. So it's a wraparound programme which is evidence-based research which shows reduction rearrest rates in out-of-home placements, and support is there 24/7. So it's just, I suppose, to look at the issues of mental health and addiction and disability, and having a support there that, you know, encourages people to come to court. And the bail schemes are in Scotland, UK, Australia, and I suppose it's just about focusing on the actual need to support as well as supervise as a basic principle.
Thank you, Michelle. Mary, please.
The first thing to say is that it's a notable feature of our system that we have such a wide range of very flexible conditions which can be imposed on a person and which can be tailored to the particular concern which the court has about them, be it flight risk or, excuse me, evading justice or reoffending. And that is potentially very extensive and can involve multiple kinds of conditions and requirements on behaviour. In the study that we completed, and we also observed bail hearings and interviewed practitioners, judges and staff of the probation service, and there was also a strong view amongst our participants that there was like a standard list of conditions which are imposed in every case, the signing on condition, the curfew condition, being contactable by a mobile phone and staying away from certain areas or people. And some of our participants, and notably defence practitioners, criticised what they saw as a tendency to impose, take a sort of kitchen sink approach to conditions. So making sure that you're tailoring conditions to ensure that you're targeting the precise concern is very important. So our system of conditions is already very extensive and very flexible, notably so in comparison to our European neighbours. It's really essential. The question of full information before a court is absolutely necessary to consider. And that implies a very well-functioning IT system and a very well-functioning system for sharing of data between the various criminal justice agencies and within individual agencies. So that would be a very important thing to recommend. The monitoring of conditions to make sure that the court has the full information before it is really key. The second question is about monitoring of conditions generally, and that is definitely a question for Garda resources, absolutely so. And the third question is, those individuals who are coming before the courts are the same cohort who are within the prison system. And we know from multiple studies that the backgrounds of most of those individuals are characterised by problems with housing, problems with addiction, and many having problems with mental health. And that was very much borne out in the research that we completed, that our participants referred to a lack of housing as a major impediment to a person who's trying to live a better life, addiction being a major concern, and mental health concerns. So then what do we do in that scenario? If those factors are making it more likely that the person is going to either not turn up for their trial or to commit offences while on bail. And that's where you get into the area of bail supervision and support schemes. So the extern scheme, which has been mentioned for young people, that did receive a great deal of praise amongst our research participants who felt that it was very effective and it was working. And the final point on this I'd like to make is, I think it's very tempting and completely understandable in discussions like this that we view the bail hearing as an opportunity to intervene, because naturally a person has come to the attention of the authorities, there's a strong suspicion against them, and they may have a prior record which is very troubling and very worrying. And I think then we immediately rush to that moment to say, what can we do now? And naturally, we turn to legislation to think, how can we ensure that this kind of thing isn't going to happen again? But what that fails to see is the multiple stages in the process before then, which have not identified what's going on with this person, or the previous encounters they've had with the judicial system which have not prevented them from coming to the attention of the courts again. So I think what we see then with bail is often it's this kind of sticking plaster that we're going to intervene right now and do what we can right now, which then limits our focus on what really might have an effect, which is to address what's actually going on and what are the underlying causes here. So to sum up, I would say we already have a very extensive system of conditions. Full information before a court is really essential. Monitoring definitely needs to be looked at. I think there are some questions there. And then the issue of supervision and support is also one which merits attention.
Thank you very much. Deputy O'Caoláin, would you like to come in on that first
Too
point?
much time, but just to say to Donegal, you would still, in order for Section 2A to be triggered under the proposed bill, you would still have to have a conviction for a relevant offence within the period 5 years. So you wouldn't have a situation where somebody could be refused bail without having been convicted of a relevant offence. But it's not, I don't want to take up too much time about that, but that's my assessment.
Okay, all right. Deputy O'Leary, could you move along with what other questions if you have more?
Sure, and just to add the point, like, look, that's my reading of it at the minute, but I'll reflect on it again, maybe if there's a report to be written. I have two remaining points, and I'll add them together, and people want to address them. But it's just not looking for a response on it. Like, it's very much my own view that there needs to be more, particularly for the Gardaí, there needs to be more resourcing for to pursue people where there are significant breaches of bail. Like, there are numerous cases that have been highlighted. The case of Shane O'Farrell is a well-known example, but there are other cases as well where significant breaches of bail happened and nothing was done to address that. And I think that's as significant issue as what we have before us, is where conditions are laid down that they're not pursued. Just in relation to my final two questions, or I suppose, final two questions in relation to electronic monitoring. Like, firstly, I would make the point that this is already something that's possible. I do believe it has a role. Deputy O'Caoláin has made the point that sometimes it can be defined as liberal or conservative or reactionary or whatever way you want to put it. I believe that with certain safeguards in certain circumstances, it can have a role, but I think that those safeguards need to exist, and we also need to have a sense of how effective it can be in the particular circumstances. So I suppose the question I would have is, and we discussed this issue generally last week as well with a different set of guests, but I would be of the view that electronic monitoring is only as effective as the people who are charged with monitoring the information it provides. And if the information that electronic tagging provides shows that people are in places they're not meant to be, or not in the place that they're meant to be, then that's not actually putting us in a particularly different situation to where we are now, where people are breaching conditions of bail in relation to location and all the rest of it. Electronic tagging might provide us with additional information, but it's not going to necessarily prevent anybody doing any of those things unless the resources exist, again, within the Gardaí to pursue people with this. I suppose my final question there is specifically for the IPRT, but Dr. Rogan or Ms. Dean, if you want to address them, you may as well. The constitutional issues in relation to the imperative, I think I understand the point, but I just want to see it elaborated if possible. Like, there's an imperative being provided in this bill that the judge shall refuse bail. Having said that, within the same section, there is something of a safeguard in relation to, and just if I pull up the bill here, if such refusal is considered necessary to prevent the commission of a relevant offence by that person. So I suppose to ask the question, in your view, that doesn't save it constitutionally or anything? So.
No, well, in my view, effectively the court already has the power to refuse an application under the 1997 Act, and that was introduced in response to a referendum which was put to the people and has been passed, and was the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. So the option is already there. And I also, I suppose, reiterate the point that Mary made, that having the full information before the court is extremely important to ensure that the appropriate decision is made in a particular case. But this amendment moves us well beyond that, so it's not a permissive, allowing the court to take that decision if it wishes to, but it makes it mandatory, so it completely removes any judicial space for looking at all of the relevant factors. And they will include, and are well known, but they will include something like the seriousness of this particular charge that is in front of the court, the strength of the evidence, which varies widely in each particular case, the previous convictions, the length of likely time to trial, looking at issues like, is there evidence of potential intimidation of a victim's family? These are all relevant issues. And it is only possible for a judge in a case to have that evidence in front of them, be faced with two lawyers, usually defence and prosecutor, or presenting Garda, and weigh up this very difficult balancing act, but weigh up that evidence in light of the constitutional framework that is there, and try to make the best decision in each particular case. That is the system that is there at the moment, and what this does is undercuts that, makes it mandatory in every case, which of course we would, ideally we would have a situation where that type of provision could deliver a reduction in pre-trial offending. But what it does is it ignores the fact that each of these specific cases are different in terms of the factors that are present. And also, obviously, and I'll just mention it, ignores the fact of what implications will this have if a blanket provision is introduced for our prisons. I mean, we woke up today to headlines of 6 of 12 of our prisons are overcrowded. Prisoners are sleeping on the floor at the moment. So it is important that the resources we have are targeted where they're needed. So those that are a risk, those that may intimidate witnesses, will be refused pre-trial detention. But where you introduce a blanket like this and you hugely increase the number of those who are in pre-trial detention, not necessarily those that ought to be, but those that happen to fall foul of a provision like this. So it's unconstitutional in my view, but it's also going to be ineffective, because when that happens, the resources that are available within our prisons to deal with people who are there serving a sentence after conviction are completely diluted. You have chaos on the landings. You have not enough officers to deal with the offending behaviours programs that are there to get people to education, to try and do some work that will reduce the risk of offending in the future. So that doesn't deliver a safer community. It's very important that the provisions that are there are used in the right way to ensure the right people are detained where there is risk identified and that evidence is before a court. But in my view, only a judge can make that decision within the limits of the law that's available to them.
Thank you, Deirdre. Mary, would you like to come in?
To return to the question of electronic monitoring, I think the most important question is, what is it going to be for? And it's notable that in the other countries which form part of our study, that electronic monitoring was introduced to reduce the number of people in pre-trial detention. That was its purpose, because the rates were so high. An alternative was sought to try and bring those numbers down. So that does not seem to be the purpose behind the proposed introduction in this case, but an additional monitoring for individuals in certain circumstances. And that raises the question of what the value of that is. And just to, again, share the experiences from the other countries which were part of our study, those participants from those other countries expressed serious doubts about the ability of electronic monitoring to actually prevent offending, because there's in all of the countries which were part of the study which had electronic monitoring, there was evidence that practitioners were unclear as to what the purposes and what the real practical possibilities of electronic monitoring are, because we know it's not possible to have a scenario where you have eyes on an individual at all times and in all circumstances. And the experience has also been that it imposes quite a lot of logistical and administrative burdens on a court in trying to set the thing up, and also then in monitoring the experience after it's been imposed. So I think a really important question, which hasn't been answered in Ireland yet, I think, is what is the purpose of electronic monitoring? Is it to reduce pre-trial detention rates, or is it something else? And I think then you might get different answers depending on what your perspective on that is. And I really would strongly recommend, respectfully, that evidence is taken from those who are responsible for administering these systems in other countries, for example, Belgium and the Netherlands, and I'd be very happy to support any such requests to those who were participants in our study, who were the research partners in our study, to facilitate that, to hear what the exact experience is. On the other point of the existing legislation, I suppose just to note that the 2015 Act and then the 2017 Act both have taken steps to reduce the likelihood of bail being granted in certain circumstances, but they maintain the discretion. And as Deirdre has mentioned, what we've seen in our study, the observations that we completed and the interviews that we did, it is an argument, and there are multiple factors which are present in any discussion about whether bail is to be granted or not. And I think limiting discretion for a person who has the opportunity to hear all of that evidence and hear all of the various concerns and the possible ways to address those concerns would be quite a significant step and a big change in our approach to pre-trial detention thus far. And when we do see more emphasis on risk of offending as a ground, we have very clear evidence from the other European countries in our study that pre-trial detention rates tend to go up, and that's put there as information. People may have views on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that is a likely outcome, and it's just something to be aware of, and it's why I'm recommending an impact assessment in terms of the numbers who are likely to be placed on pre-trial detention as a result of the bill.
Okay, Mary, thank you very much. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Would you like to add anything to it, Joe?
Firstly, I'd like to say I'm not a lawyer, but I understand what Mary and Deirdre are saying. It's obvious that there's a current law there to refuse bail. We don't feel it's being applied well enough because it's not, the evidence given by Gardaí or families is not being listened to maybe sufficiently, and where bail is breached, I don't think maybe the information is being recorded sufficiently. Data is not being shared with other regions. Therefore, people are free to move around and offend in one area and nothing is done about it, and they go to another area and commit another offence. And I think we need to join up a few dots to make the system more effective. And the electronic tagging when it comes to homicide, you can have a tag on your ankle and still shoot somebody or stab somebody. It's not going to stop that. It may place you at the scene of the crime after the event, but I'm not sure it would prevent such an attack if that were to happen. So I think that's what I would say about that.
Thank you, Deputy O'Leary.
I don't think has addressed the electronic tagging issue, just if that's possible.
Deirdre,
could you address
the constitutionality of the electronic tagging issue?
Yes.
No, it's more the. Sorry, you did deal with constitutionality and all that, but more so the efficacy of it, and the point I was making that look, it's only as good as the system that's backing it up in terms of human results.
Certainly. I mean, I suppose I don't want to stray into an area that I don't have expertise in. So in terms of Garda resourcing, for example, certainly I would agree with you that it certainly appears that unless you have sufficient Garda resources to back up the system, then the system it doesn't deliver anything that you need it to deliver, would wish it to deliver. I know it was said earlier about electronic tagging surely would be a good thing if it is used as an alternative to custody. So if it was used as an alternative to pre-trial detention. I'd echo the concerns of Mary in relation to electronic tagging. If it was used as a genuine alternative where custody was very likely, there might be some merit in it. But the reality is we are very far from being prepared. We're operating with very little information when it comes to the potential impact of this on rates of incarceration, on our court system, on our ability to kind of deliver this at all. So I think I would echo Mary's view about a full impact assessment, but certainly there's a number of other steps that could be taken in relation to not having pro forma bail conditions across the board for everyone and tailoring those conditions for the right people to meet them, and looking into the issue of data sharing among criminal justice agencies, which is clearly not yet at a level that it should be, in order to inform us all in relation to having evidence-based policy on all of these issues.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you. Deputy Clare Daly, please.
Chair, and thanks very much for coming in. I think it's incredibly timely, actually, that you're here in light of the discussions we had last week. We had a number of different sessions, one with a group from Ireland North and South, where issues around electronic monitoring actually was introduced as well, in terms of sex offences, and particularly child sexual offences, and how they might be regulated. And we had some other bills last week as well. But I think it's interesting in that, like Jim made the point, which I don't really agree with, that politicians know the people. It's very in that's our great asset. Well, I'm not so sure about that. It could be said, and he's absolutely right, that issues of crime and sentencings are huge issues of public interest, where our tabloid media in particular play a very damaging role, if you like, in informing, as in misinforming the public around these issues, and actually preying on the hurt that's been done to victims as well, and not actually helping anybody. And politicians have a responsibility then in our responses to the genuine hurt and problems that are there to deal with these things in an evidence-based way. And sometimes what we put forward actually fuels that media problem rather than addresses it properly. And I think we had bills here last week, one in particular, where basically it was as plain as could be that the bill wasn't going to achieve anything in terms of what it said it would, but it was being put forward as an emotional response to an horrific crime. And I don't agree with that type of method. And I know Jim doesn't normally do that either. But in terms of this bill, I'm not sure, because the purpose of this bill is, and it's been put forward as making the community safer. That's what it is, making people safer in response to some of the horrible crimes that have happened while people were out on bail. But the problem is that it doesn't do that. And that it's as simple as that, because all it does is tie the hands of judges. That's what it seems to do. So we need to tease that out a bit more. And, you know, if we look at, say, some of the decisions that have been made and some of the court judgments, a lot of the time the judicial decision was not because the judge decided, I want to let this fella out, I couldn't be bothered. They were actually given inaccurate information by the Gardaí, or were not given the full picture. So changing this legislation is not going to address the deficit in information that's often given to judges. And I think we should maybe hear a little bit more on that point, because, you know, and I very much take Joan's point that the judges should listen to senior Gardaí, but there's been some awful cases in recent years where senior Gardaí have given very bad evidence in the opposite case as well, and we've kind of moved away from just because a guard gives it, because instinctively judges do kind of side with the guards, but there's been a lot of information that would say that they haven't always been as good as it says on the tin. But just a couple of things, right, in terms of it. I think it would be said that it's been emphasised here actually by the Supreme Court and the European Court of Human Rights that while previous convictions can be considered in relation to bail applications, there are serious constitutional issues in terms of rights to liberty when making previous convictions a reason for mandatory refusal of bail. And I'd like Jim to tease that out a bit more, particularly when you're taking away from a judge the possibility of that judge factoring in other issues, such as maybe disability, serious illness, other criteria that should be taken into account. I'm particularly keen to have explored, and again, it's really due to Jim, it is timely that the report of the PQ answers we got in terms of prison overcrowding was in the media today. Because what are we saying here? Like, we're going to, if you like, incarcerate more people pre-trial and put them into a prison service which has 676 people sleeping on mattresses over the course of July. How is that going to impact on the safety of staff, on the morale of other prisoners, on education, training, all that kind of thing? So I'd like to know, in terms of research in this, the rise in prison numbers, and we know they're there, that they've gone over the 4,000 now. Is that, or what level of research has been done? I know Mary gave some good figures there in terms of the numbers up in terms of those on pre-trial detention, but is there what level of analysis has been done to show where is that rise in incarceration coming from, and is it linked to bail breaches? That would be one thing there. I think another point that I'd like to hear more of is evidence around a lot of this, particularly around electronic monitoring. It was provided for since '06, but it hasn't been implemented anywhere in the state except under the Irish Prison Service in relation to monitoring people on temporary release. Now, the Criminal Justice Bill last year was enacted. The impact hasn't been reflected in any single statistics because there hasn't been a year at all. Would we not be better off to analyse this a bit more? You know, why hasn't it been implemented? If it's a great, and in fairness, everybody last week says it's not a silver bullet. So the people from the north and the other areas where been said it's not a silver bullet, and everybody here agrees with that. It actually hasn't been implemented or monitored. Particularly, should we not be doing that first? There were constitutional issues also raised about mandatory monitoring, removing judicial discretion. Has there been any issues there? And I think certainly if anybody has information in terms of the lack of safeguards detailed in the provision to operate an effective monitoring system, really needs to be taken into account as well. Plus cost effectiveness as well. They're hugely expensive and difficult to monitor. So if you like, by us, if we were to go along with this, we're creating the illusion of making society safer, but we're actually ignoring all of the evidence that says that this doesn't do that. And I think putting legislation on the statute books on that basis is incredibly concerning when we could be diverting resources. Because if this was to be brought in and the judges had to incur, it's incredibly costly to send them in prison. It's incredibly costly to do electronic monitoring. You would be far better investing in the types of initiatives that Joan talked about, you know, beefing up the probation service to give people support while they're on bail, that they understand the conditions, that they turn up in court, all this kind of good stuff, and that as well, because I just think this is definitely a wrong direction. And I would emphasise the point Deirdre made, the judges have power. It's not that they're, and restrictions are imposed all the time, all the time. And again, maybe people might want to comment on judicial guidelines. Again, we could be improving sentencing guidelines, even how they deal with pre-trial. All that area, to me, would have a far better basis, I think. So it's just a couple of comments, really, because I think the points have been incredibly well made by the panel.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. Maybe just to shuffle it around a little bit, Mary, would you mind if I start with you this time, just to give everybody a little turn?
Thank you, and I thank the Deputy for the questions. To take the first point about electronic monitoring, again, I come back to this question of what the purpose is and what the possible impact is. And that's not to say, you know, that there isn't a role for electronic monitoring in some circumstances, but we have to take on board the evidence of other jurisdictions where it's been in place for some time. There are lots of questions to ask. Would you use, for example, electronic monitoring as a form of a location ban type system, or would you use it as a form of house arrest? What would be the actual modality by which electronic monitoring would be used? I think we'd need a lot more information to be able to make a conclusion then on what the impact of electronic monitoring would be, or what the costs and so on would be. Other things which arise in the other countries which were mentioned in the study, do you use radio frequency electronic monitoring, or do you use GPS, and what are the cost implications of that? So I think there are just several practical logistical questions which deserve a lot of consideration before you take quite a significant step and begin to impose it, because if all of that hasn't been worked out in advance, you could run into a lot of difficulties later on. So again, I think taking direct evidence from those who run these systems in other countries would be very valuable. In terms of what our own participants in Ireland said, we asked them, what do you think about electronic monitoring, or what impact do you think it would have? And these are people who work in the area of bail and pre-trial detention every day of the week. There was no consensus at all amongst the group as to whether it would be a good thing or a bad thing. So we heard almost equally balanced perspectives on both sides. Some participants felt that it would be likely to lead to more bail being granted. Others felt that it would give more comfort to judges and more comfort to the public. Others felt that defendants would actually look for it, that it would be more likely to be something sought by defendants than actually something sought by the prosecution, which was quite an interesting perspective. And there was consensus on this point that the existing curfew condition and the existing condition to keep your mobile phone on at all times and in credit so that you can be contactable. But these were kind of low-tech versions of electronic monitoring, and for many participants they felt they were doing the job, and that maybe you could invest more in how those things are actually implemented, but they were in effect taking the place of electronic monitoring. On returning to the point about the constitutional implications, so we have a much longer paper which addresses some of these issues. I suppose of all the things that could be said, to summarise, we have the DPP and Mulvey case, which it does note that bail is not an automatic right. There's no suggestion that the existing system means that people must get bail. But that case goes on to say it's an important aspect of the individual's constitutional right to liberty, a right which can only be restricted on limited grounds supported by cogent evidence. And I suppose if you do move into a scenario where the nature of the offence charged and aspects of the person's pre-existing offending background are the tipping point to making the decision that a person goes into pretrial detention, you do raise questions about whether you are in conformity with that existing principle from DPP and Mulvey. The numbers on pretrial detention and overall questions about data and what's driving the increasing numbers. And before I address that, I might look at just to touch on the question of the crime statistics. And so it has been very fairly mentioned that the crime statistics are being published under reservation. And that in itself is a really regrettable state of affairs, that our nation is not able to say with certainty what the crime statistics are, because there are question marks about the quality of the information. I was a member of an expert group on crime statistics, which was chaired by the Central Statistics Office some years ago, and I think it's really critical that we invest and support our Central Statistics Office in gathering this kind of information and ensuring that what's being put out into the public, which has real effects in terms of public perception and also on policy making, is absolutely accurate and beyond reproach. So I think it is really important that we know that the CSO statistics are still under reservation, and so there are questions about whether improved accuracy in recording data might be playing a role here too. That's not to minimise in any way the numbers that we're seeing, which are worrying. As to whether the rises in pretrial detention figures are a factor behind the overall rise in the prison population, I suppose, as a general point, we really need much more analysis in general of what's going on. So we need regular assessments of what are the offence types that are going in, what are the prior backgrounds of people that are going in, is it a change in sentencing practice, is it a factor of increased crime rates or increased guard activity? We just don't know, and I think that a vacuum for penal policy making is very serious. I suppose I'd just go back to the graphs which I've presented to the committee, the numbers I mentioned earlier. We are seeing rises in the numbers of people in pretrial detention. So if that's roughly speaking about 200 additional people per day in the prison system, that is going to have an effect. And just to note again, I mean, the numbers overall are much smaller, but the numbers when it comes to women have really increased a lot. And I think a lot of assessment needs to go into why that's the case. And finally, just to pick up on Deputy Daly's point about, I suppose, really the lens through which you view these issues. And the question is really to take the road of legislation or to take the road of other ways to try and do what we all want to do, which is to have safer communities and people feeling safe and people feeling that they've received justice and so on. And I just returned to the Penal Policy Review Group, which published in 2014, and I'm the chairperson of the Implementation Oversight Group for that report. And that report emphasised again and again that we are not going to get the solutions we want unless we look at a whole-of-government approach to the issue of crime and offending, and we make sure that when we are bringing in any changes or reforms in the area of crime, offending and prisons and probation and so on, that we make sure we include in those conversations health professionals, health experts, people who are experts in addiction, people who are experts in social policy. So I guess it comes down to what lens do you want to look at these issues through, and the Penal Policy Review Group would very much advocate the need for a whole-of-government approach. And I might just mention the work of Dr. Ruth Barrington's group, an interagency group for a safer and fairer Ireland, which is trying to look at these issues from a more interdepartmental, interagency perspective, and I think that work needs a lot more support.
Thank you very much. And come to Fiona.
Thank you, Deputy Daly, for the question. And as you pointed out with the headlines this morning, it's really important that we're having this conversation. I would just echo everything that Dr. Rogan has just said, and that we welcome the data and research strategy of the Department of Justice and Equality, and also the active recruitment that's happening at the same time. So hopefully going forward in the future, we'll have more evidence on which to base our responses to public concerns and public safety. I'm only going to add a few figures to what Dr. Rogan has said. Again, we don't know what the drivers are in the absence of information, but we can see, looking at the 31st of October as a snapshot over the last 5 years, and I chose that date because it's the most up-to-date. On the 31st of October 2018, there were 809 prisoners on remand and trial. In 2017, it was 745, 2016, 648. So this is in line with Dr. Rogan's point about an extra 200 in or around. Yesterday, 18% of people in prison were on remand, but 23.3% of women in prison. I'm mindful that women in prison are more likely to be there for less serious offences. It's certainly an issue that we need to be looking at. And just to go back to the bail, if you're looking at the most effective use of resources, the bail supervision scheme, which has been run by Extern at Oberstown. So the Department of Children and Youth Affairs awarded Extern just under €490,000 to run the scheme in 2017, for which they engaged and supported 24 young people. Now that has to be considered in line of the costs of holding a young person in Oberstown over a year are in the region of 350 to 400,000 per young person. So we're looking at the most effective, but also the least damaging, because we also have to be mindful that the effect of detention has multiple damaging effects, be you an adult with caring responsibilities or a child for whom detention must be a sanction of last resort.
All right. Fiona, thank you. Yes, Michelle, please.
Just is it the increase on the numbers of people on remand, and Penal Reform International did a study last year and again highlighted the increase of people on remand and the number of women being sentenced to prison, and highlighted issues around domestic violence and the number of ethnic minorities in prison, but also just the fact that from a PQ last year, the number of remand prisoners sharing a cell with sentenced prisoners was around 222. And just in relation to data, the Irish Prison Service, I think, following the UN recommendation about publishing more data on remand, has recently started publishing data on their website about remand figures.
Thank you, Michelle. I don't know if Joan wanted to add anything, just finally to Deputy Daly.
I would agree with everything that's being said, but I think that while we debate the merits or demerits of electronic monitoring, we have to acknowledge that we have a problem. We have a very real problem. For instance, in a very recent trial where a man was convicted of murder, and it turned out that he had 78 previous convictions and had been out on bail when that murder occurred. And only 3 days prior to that murder, he had attempted a similar random street attack on somebody else, which thankfully was unsuccessful. So where you have those kind of occurrences, obviously a breach of bail has occurred and somebody is still walking around free to commit further serious crimes. You know, why are we having situations where multiple breaches of bail are allowed to happen, where people are free to commit other serious crimes? And, you know, as I said earlier, I think particularly in the case of homicide, if a human life has been taken and somebody receives bail, that's fine. But where that bail is breached for any reason, any nature at all of the breach, it has to be considered a further serious offence. And really, we need to be looking at at what's happening on the ground, while we debate the merits and demerits of other measures as well. It's happening today. There'll be somebody out on bail will commit a very serious offence, and probably will get a slap on the wrist. Maybe I'm not a lawyer. I can't go into the details of what may happen, but it is happening, and we know this. And people are being killed, and it's avoidable if we apply the law that exists properly, if we follow up, and again, it may be resources, and if resources are the issue that's causing this to happen, then we can't be looking at other solutions that will take even more resources.
Thank you, Joan. Deputy Daly, was there anything else you wanted just to add before I move on?
No, just very brief. I mean, obviously the points that Joan made there about the recent horrible, and it wouldn't be addressed by Jim's bill either, but it's good that we're having that. I mean, I suppose we need to look at what are the reasons why people commit crimes, and why do they breach their bail conditions, and who is charged with monitoring that and sharing the information, and the interagency lack of cooperation. To me, if that was installed or introduced properly, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably, rather than just tying the hands of judges, because that's really all this does. And it assumes that the information the judiciary are getting is accurate, when actually there's a big argument to be said about beefing up in terms of Garda information, probation officer reports, all of that sort of backup and support. No, look, I don't want to add to it, but I do think it's important. Things like 23% of women on remand is incredibly troubling because of the destabilisation impact of that, and the evidence that's there to show that a woman going into prison and the impact that has on a family and children being taken into care or whatever is far worse than in terms of a man. So we need to look at that. Look, incarceration is always damaging. Putting people in earlier, if when they come out of their sentence they're going to re-offend, is not dealing with the issue. The issue is far more complex than that, and I don't think legislation like this helps. But
Okay, thank you, Deputy Daly. We'll move on to Deputy Jack Chambers, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank Deputy O'Caoláin and.
I thought that it'll pick up here now.
I don't have anything personally, Chairman.
I'd like to thank Deputy O'Caoláin and the guests for attending. I suppose just to go back to a point that Joan made. I mean, obviously, look, whilst there is there's a qualification on the crime statistics and the trends that are there, the trends are going in a worrying direction around the whole bail issue and repeat offences and the recidivism that we're seeing. So I know you're obviously taking an approach around the legislation that says, you believe there's constitutional implications and so on. Like, is there any type of legislative changes that you'd welcome that would balance the concerns that you're raising with what is a worrying trend? And no one can deny that there is real human stories where people are faced with, where they're the victim of serious offences, whether it's murder, burglaries, and there are, again, we can't generalise the people behind those offences, as others have mentioned. There's difficult life stories behind how people, as Clare mentioned, how people end up doing something. But there are also a cohort of psychopaths, some probably a vast minority, very few, but there are some who are slipping through, and it's difficult. I recognise in a legislative piece to balance all those considerations, and there are some who continue to re-offend and are slipping through all the time. So I suppose that's my question. Like, seeing the trends and the legislation, is there any considerations you would give as experts in the law here, and obviously on penal reform, whereby we could move to try and clarify the legislative framework we have to obviously balance the constitutional considerations and also the aspirations we have around penal reform, which are important, and I recognise that around addiction and the complexity of incarceration as well. But I think whilst a whole of government approach is important too, something needs to happen, and communities are faced with, increased fear, but also anger when they see people, committing the same offence over and over, and they hear from maybe the guard who is investigating the burglary that they know who that was, and they're in a cycle of this. So I think, I suppose I'd just like to know how you would see this in terms of the policy and legislative changes, and whether there could be a relative amendments that could balance your considerations, or does it rest completely outside of legislative change? Thank
Who
you.
would you like to direct that to first?
Or anybody, yeah, everybody.
Who would like to, Deirdre, would you like to take it this time? Yeah.
I think the very opening of this, I said that the Commission of Offences on Bail is absolutely rightly a matter of concern to this committee and to their constituents and to society at large. There's absolutely no denying that at all. I think the premise of your question presupposes that the solution lies in legislation, or in more legislation. And I suppose that's where there's a significant point of difference between us. We all would love if it was as simple as introducing a new provision which made refusal of bail mandatory, and that will slash the rates of crime that are committed on bail. But the reality is, if that was the solution, it would have been discovered and used in other jurisdictions. It has never delivered what you're asking for. The difficult reality about crime and criminality in Ireland and in every other country is that its causes are complex. The way it happens over time is complex. The criminal justice system is complex, and the interrelationship between social justice or injustice and the criminal justice system is complex. And the solution to these things is never straightforward, and there is never a silver bullet. But there are several proposals between what Professor Rogan has said and what we have said, and indeed what Joan has said as well, in terms of looking at the rights of victims within the criminal justice system in general and ensuring that they're protected, using the legislation that is already there in relation to the imposition of conditions, and indeed to having proper consultation with victims' families where there are fears of intimidation. It's making sure that Gardaí are resourced to do the job that they have to do properly. It's ensuring there is an impact assessment of any criminal justice measure before it happens, so we know what is likely to happen. It's collecting data so we know the measures that are being used, not used, and their efficacy. That answer is a messy answer because the system is messy, crime is messy, and social justice and injustice are messy. There aren't silver bullets, but it is going to require the committee and indeed legislators at large to start to grapple with what I suppose penal reformers and academics have been saying for the last 25 years, which is the roots of these problems are happening when people are in their childhood and teenage years, and the failures in services at those points. We're not saying that excuses crime, but we're saying the state often has many opportunities to intervene and provide services for people, and they are failing at the moment as we speak in terms of homelessness, in terms of mental health provision, in terms of addiction services. So as long as we try to address the issue of offending on bail in a vacuum, as if it exists without relationship to anything that happens before, then we're not going to solve the issue, which is clearly a significant issue, and I don't think anyone on the panel would attempt to suggest that these numbers are not anything but concerning. But the solution does not lie in more legislation. It lies in a whole number of other areas, which are difficult but not impossible.
No legislation whatsoever. You wouldn't be for any legislative change?
The legislation already exists. The legislation is there to provide for electronic monitoring. It's there to provide for refusal of bail. It's there to consider the issue of flight risk. The legislation is there already. So if the legislation is there already, we have to look at the whole set of other points in the system, including Garda resourcing, including the use of pro forma conditions, including perhaps the failure to monitor bail conditions, or the inability to monitor bail conditions because they're being handed out on a blanket basis, and indeed the support that's required in terms of victims' families as well. So it's not about not expecting or not accepting that refusal of bail is appropriate in some instances. It's about accepting the reality that the solution to this does not lie in further legislation, because the legislation is already there to allow judges to refuse bail where that's appropriate. But clearly, between the work that Dr. Rogan has done in terms of assessing the complexity of the issue when it comes to electronic monitoring, and what we know about failures in the social system that happen years and years before people reach the criminal justice system, these are complex issues that require, unfortunately, and difficultly, if that's a word, they do require a whole-of-government approach. They do require data, so we know what's happening, we understand the reasons why they're happening, and those are difficult things to deliver, and those require resources. But the answer is not the simple solution to propose two provisions and expect them to solve this problem, which is of clear concern to everybody.
I don't think, in fairness, I think, you know, well, I'm not speaking for Deputy O'Caoláin, but I don't think, you know, I think he accepts that it's complex. I know from previous contributions, and certainly I do as well, but I suppose, you know, it's the case of, can legislation play a role in the complex solution, or can any amendment play any role? And well, I suppose to go back to can that legislation ever perform any role in solving these complex issues across any area of policy? I suppose that's a case of, you know, broadening it out. But no, I take your point, and I don't know if other people want to make contributions.
Right, okay. Dr. Rogan, please.
Deputy. I think it's absolutely an honourable intention to be seeking to reduce offending and to reduce offending on bail. I mean, offending on bail is an insult to the public. It's a harm to victims. It's a harm to communities. And as others have mentioned, I think we all share the same objective, which is to make sure that communities are as safe as they possibly can be, and that people are protected. And I think it's just about differences in approach to what you think might be the most effective way in achieving that. The question of offending while on bail, I think, is linked to the broader question of prolific offending generally. So while this is not something which is a suggestion for legislative amendment, I think it's definitely something which merits further analysis by the criminal justice agencies in cooperation with research to see what the extent of prolific offending is and reoffending, and what are the factors which maybe can be influenced to try to bring that down. And that may well include more monitoring. It may well include more supervision. It's likely to. It may well include recommendations on legislation. But I think a study, an analysis at departmental level of prolific offending and reoffending would be very useful. I would also go back to the broader question of what can legislation do. I go back to the Penal Policy Review Group from 2014, which the context there was we had historic highs in prison numbers, a feeling that the objectives of penal policy were not clear, a feeling that there was a lack of energy or enthusiasm almost for what we could achieve to make sure our communities were safer. So it sought to take stock of the penal system as a whole and suggest a blueprint for what might actually work to improve our penal policy and to reduce the rates of offending. And that the Penal Policy Review Group comprised senior members of the department, senior members of the Irish Prison Service and the Probation Service, a judge, consultant psychiatrists and people from civil society organisations, and I was a member of it for a period, so you can take that into account in your analysis of it. But the blueprint that set out was what all of these individuals who are very experienced in the criminal justice agencies decided was that in the end the most effective approach is the one which prioritises a whole of government approach, which understands that crime is a multi-dimensional, multifaceted issue within which legislation absolutely plays a role, but where the more likely effective outcomes are to be found outside of legislation. And I think we have to bear that in mind. So when it comes to, possible duties and things to be imposed, I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen if we place a duty on all departments and agencies to cooperate to prevent crime. So that might be around the information sharing side. And it might also be about bringing them together to put forward policies that across the board are going to work to seek to prevent crime and to promote safer communities. I'd also want to mention the Victims Directive, that it's really important, and the Penal Policy Review Group emphasised this, that must be monitored for its full implementation. If we are to really address the concerns of victims properly, I think we must make sure that legislation is being fully implemented and monitored at all stages. Deirdre has mentioned that the legislation does exist already. There is legislation, quite robust legislation in place. And I'd also finish on this point. Of the 7 countries we studied, some of them used risk of offending very extensively. And I'd note Austria, there was evidence from our research that in the Austrian case, 90% of the pre-trial decisions were made on the ground of risk of offending. And we see the same frustration amongst practitioners and participants there about crime rates, about reoffending, about all of the concerns that we all share about the effect which crime has on people. So I guess, you know, the point in summary is it's absolutely the case that something needs to happen, and the question is, what is the best mechanism to make it happen? And legislation, while it has a role to play, isn't always the most effective. And I would definitely emphasise again the need for incorporating into these kinds of discussions the perspective of health, the perspective of social policy, the perspective of mental health.
Thank you. Mary. And Joan, would you like to add to what's been said?
I would totally agree with a lot of what Mary is saying, and Deirdre also. It seems that the legislation that exists at the moment could be sufficient to deal with it, but I think it's our application of that legislation that leaves a lot to be desired. I think firstly we have to acknowledge we have a problem, and in order to solve any problem you have to measure it. If we can measure the problem and present the proper information to a court to enable them to, as Deirdre suggested, tailor the bail conditions, that would be a good step forward. Also, I think maybe a psychological report, Garda evidence and the views of a family, I'm speaking specifically about homicide now, should definitely be taken into account before bail is granted. But bail having been granted is not something we would object to. You know, we understand that bail happens. Our issue is where bail is breached and nothing is being done about that. And that's a very identifiable problem. You know, that's not a hidden problem. It's very, very out there. And what can we do to address that? Is it a Garda resource? And maybe that's where the resources need to be put.
Chambers, had you any little point to make? Just are you happy with that?
No, thanks, Chair. No, I suppose I take your general point as well that when we're looking doing penology and Trinity, I think where you're lecturing, and actually the political interaction of penal policy has been quite damaging over generations, and I accept that as a evidence-based point that we have to be careful as well about how we set and interact with penal policy. And if you look at, say, Finland, I think, which has made a lot of positive changes and has addressed issues like recidivism and other aspects. So I note that that's important that we remember that when we're discussing issues of penal reform. So thanks again.
Thank you, Deputy Chambers. Senator Frances Black, please.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your presentations today. Very clear and precise presentations. I suppose this is my first time kind of really getting an understanding of Jim's bill, and Joan, firstly I think the work that you're doing is absolutely fantastic, and I can't even imagine what it would be like for a family member to lose somebody, to homicide, particularly if somebody, when you bring it back to that human level, of what it's like for family members and the devastation that they feel when they lose somebody in that way. I mean, it must be one of the worst things, you know, that can happen to a family. So I just wanted to kind of name that, and I really hear, I suppose, your frustration in a way around the judicial system. I don't know a huge amount about the judicial system, but I do know, you know, that there are, you use the word, Deirdre, very messy. It can be very messy because, you know, you're dealing with so much trauma and crisis and addiction, mental health, and that's an area I would be very familiar with. So, you know, I really understand, and I understand why Jim would want to bring, you know, a bill like this forward, because, you know, it is about protecting the community. But in my own work, and again, coming back to the work that I do with regard to addiction and mental health and working within the prison services at times in that particular area, a lot, and I would have only worked with women, a lot of the women that we worked with, you know, are coming from trauma themselves. You know, they're coming from childhood, like what you said there, Deirdre, childhood trauma. They would have been victims of crime themselves a lot of the time, you know, and ended up, because of maybe violence or sexual abuse or whatever, ended up in addiction, you know. So it's almost, you know, there's compassion nearly. You have to have compassion from that perspective also, and you know, and I really understand that. I suppose what I'm hearing, I suppose, really from everybody, in fact, even yourself, Joan, you have an understanding, you know, from the family perspective. But what I'm hearing is, and I hope I'm getting this right, is that there needs to be more interagency work, and I totally, you know, agree with that. You know, I really believe, like, that if there was some way of interagency work, organisations working together, and you said something, Joan, that really impacted me. Families are not getting heard, you know, and they're not getting heard by the judges. That's one area, and I think that's really, really important. But if there was some way of trying to work through in that interagency work, where there is a mental health organisation, there is an addiction organisation, who can come together and work with people who commit crimes. I mean, you know, look, I can only give you one example of my mother when she had a small shop many, many years ago, and this man jumped to the counter and he had a knife, you know, and it was she was an old woman. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. Now, she survived it. He robbed her. She survived it. It went to court. And when he told his story as to why he had young kids, they were homeless, he wasn't in addiction, he just needed money, you know, she ended up, when he got 6 months, feeling really sorry for him, even though she was, you know, and I know I'm only giving a small, you know, example of the reality of people who commit crimes and why they commit crimes, you know. And there's always a story behind it. I suppose that's where I'm coming from. It doesn't help when you lose somebody. So I suppose my thing is, I'm you know, I feel personally, I'm just not sure that this is the answer. I know the prison services are, you know, when you're dealing with addiction as well, often the prison services they're in crisis, the prison officers are in crisis, they're all burnt out, they're all exhausted, they're all trying to deal with mental health issues themselves. You know, it's just a cycle, it's just a vicious circle, really, you know. And it would be great, you know, if we could look at all of that. I suppose that's where I'd be coming from around it all. So, you know, I want to thank you all for your presentations today. I think, you know, I can really hear and see I have really got a good understanding of what's going on with regard to the judicial system. I mean, we see it all the time. We saw where a judge a couple of weeks ago, or maybe last month, let a young man, you know, there was evidence that he may have committed rape, but he walked free. And then there was a woman who, you know, broke up a packet of Pringles in a shop and she got 4 months. There's something not right with the judicial system. That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm saying. And, you know, and it really does need to be addressed. But I thank you all today. I don't really have any questions. I just want to say thank you all for very clear and precise presentations today. And that's it.
Thank you, Senator Francis Black. Deputy Mick Wallace, please.
I'll be very brief, and thanks for coming in, and it's been very interesting, and the points have been very well made, so I'm not going to go over them. he said probably well put Jim's bill into oblivion, hopefully. But in fairness to Jim, at the Justice Committee last week, he said, I actually wrote down what he said. He says sentencing is an extremely complicated area and politicians sometimes try to simplify it by introducing legislation. Jim O'Caoláin said that, and that should be remembered. So he's not all bad, he isn't, right? Now, listen, I suppose I don't really have questions to you either because you've already answered them. You've given your take on it, and it makes sense to me what you're all saying. We have a lack of joined-up thinking in government. Deirdre pointed out that the state is failing many people. Many of them end up in prison. Some commit suicide. And we have legislation, and as Joan says, and has not been applied. People think that we don't have good building regulation in Ireland because we've had so much bad construction work. We have world-class building regulation in Ireland, but its implementation is not supervised, so we end up with bad buildings. But I suppose the one thing I might ask is, listen, prison doesn't work, and the numbers going up means there's something wrong as well. And rehabilitation doesn't seem to be a factor, which is what it's supposed to be. Myself and Clare go in our prisons all year for a number of years, and they don't do what they're supposed to do, and that is educate the prisoner so that he doesn't reoffend and that he's a fit member for society when he comes out. If he comes out and does it again, well, I mean, obviously it didn't work. And we know that prisons don't work, and yet we keep filling them up with people in knee-jerk responses to different areas. The one thing I would ask you is, what can we do, or what should the government be doing to address the fact that prison doesn't work, aside from the fact that it shouldn't be failing people? But I mean, we have a very black and white approach to dealing with crime. Maybe you disagree.
Thank you, Deputy Wallace. Maybe, Joan, would you like to start? And I'll just take you along, and then I'm going to bring in Deputy O'Caoláin to make a concluding contribution. Please.
Well, Deputy Wallace, I think you say prison, or the solution is very black and white. We have crime and we have punishment. I don't know what other punishment there can be for serious crime apart from prison. I wouldn't be an advocate of a death sentence, so I see prison as the only answer. And I think that's quite black and white, all right, you know. I think, you know, we need to study, we need all of the study that Mary Rogan's has done and her team have done. I think Deirdre's work is very important. I think our advocacy is important. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge we have a problem. And I agree with you, I don't think Deputy O'Caoláin's bill will do anything to address the serious issues around homicide and breaches of bail. I think we need to be looking seriously at how we apply the current legislation and resource, maybe it's a Garda resource issue, I'm not sure. But I think while we're examining why things are happening the way they're happening, we have to look at the fact that they are happening and deal with that on a very practical level. Thank you.
Deirdre, I'll give each of you, this could be our last contribution, so if you'd like to take it up, please.
Well, sure. In relation to the question of what can we do if prison doesn't work, I think there's probably several PhDs in there to answer that question. But I think there was a reference to the extreme ends of the spectrum. So, you know, extreme heaviness in the passing of a sentence recently, and at the other end, we're hearing about extreme leniency. And I think that's the difficulty when we are informing ourselves through media reporting, and media values are not the same as criminal justice values, effectively. So it is hugely important, therefore, that, as has been said a number of times, we all have access to not only detailed data, but detailed analysis of that data, that we look at evidence-based policy that has been successful elsewhere, and that we consider the effectiveness of interventions like community service orders where that's appropriate, and I'm not talking necessarily about serious offending, but there is the vast majority of crime is not at the most serious end, but unfortunately our debates are always framed around the most serious end. So it's very important to I suppose, recognise the gradation of offending that happens, and intervening at the earliest point, intervening and providing resources in the social structures and systems that hopefully will work to prevent offending, but also where offending is related to issues, where it is related to issues like addiction, mental health, homelessness, poverty, domestic violence, that the response to that deals with those underlying issues and not just the symptoms. So again, whole of government approach, more data, more resources, and also more supports and services to victims' families as well. Rights of both do not have to be in opposition. In many cases, it's about ensuring that everyone who has a role in the system is being supported to take part in that system.
Deirdre, Fiona, would you like to?
Just briefly to echo everything that's been said by Deirdre, but it's about implementation of existing policy. We have the 2013 Oireachtas Committee report on penal reform. There's the 2018 report on penal reform and sentencing by the present committee, and also the strategic review of penal policy. And if we saw resources put into actual implementation of what through engaged dialogue has come out with what will work, then we'd already be ahead.
Michelle?
Can
you follow that?
Yeah. I suppose just to highlight again, there's a lot going on adverse childhood experiences at the minute, and we're looking at the overrepresentation of children in care in the criminal justice system, and looking at residential care policies and policing, and it's just one example, but like basically trauma-informed approaches, and also looking at the numbers of people with severe mental illness in the prison system, and actually access to having services in a therapeutic environment. Central Mental Hospital, there's not enough spaces. The new hospital, there still won't be enough spaces. So again, I suppose it's the holistic approach and looking at all the different issues that are affecting those in the prison.
Thank you. And Mary?
Maybe I'll conclude with some reflections on the penal policy making process as a whole. And just to say, I suppose, from our own history and the experience of other countries, when we see times where the tenor of criminal justice policy making discussion is around what can legislation do, and focusing on what can be achieved through legislative means, we tend to see prison populations rising. And we've seen that in our own history in the mid-90s, the mid-2000s, and I guess it's for you to decide if those approaches have been successful to date, and if they had, would we need to be in this position presently? So I think my final conclusion would be about the importance of changing our approach to policy making, and that would include discussions, having proper, robust evidence on what is actually the position at present, what is likely to work, what works elsewhere, what's the international experience. And I might note your own report in this respect and its advocacy for an approach to policy making which is more informed. And I might also note the Penal Policy Review Group's recommendation to have a consultative council in place to examine where changes are needed, to look at what information we have on the situation, to look at what's going on elsewhere, and then to propose recommendations or reforms. And I think this bill, for example, would have been it would have been very valuable to have this bill placed before a group like that, and this process has been very valuable. And I think if we see that kind of approach to policy making, we might get closer to being able to provide real effective answers to the problems that we all want to address.
Thank you, Mary. Jim, just before asking you to make the concluding remark, I think it's important to take on board. I think the membership absolutely identify with the motivation behind the work that you've invested in this, and you deserve great credit for that. We're all very, very conscious of the fact that countless people have been let down by the failures of either some in the system or a failure of and by the system. and all of that has been reflected and reflected very well. And I just want to thank you for referencing our own report on penal reform and the sentencing report that we invested quite a lot of time into. And you made the critical word, I'm not sure, was it Fiona or Michelle, but implementation. Would that we had the opportunity is how each of us here would react to that. We only have the power of recommendation. We cannot direct, unfortunately. The last word, Jim.
Thanks very much. And just in conclusion, I want to thank you all for coming in. I want to thank you for the submissions and the effort you made in respect to this. I've listened very carefully to it. Obviously, I disagree with some parts of what you said, but I will take on board what you said and indeed what my colleagues had said. But can I just make a few concluding remarks? I'm slightly concerned that we got into it, and this happens when you get the politicians in the room, we've gone into a much broader discussion about penal policy than about the specifics of the bill. Because the specifics of the bill, Chairman, were designed to deal with an issue that everyone here recognises is a problem. The fact that there is a problem with people on bail committing serious offences. I think everyone on the panel agrees that that is an issue. And the issue for us is to determine what can be done in respect to that. I'm absolutely certain that there's no single solution to it. I don't suggest that this piece of legislation is the solution to it at all, and I'm concerned that the piece of legislation was reflected upon as being a solution to other problems as well. It's not. It seeks to deal with the very specific, significant issue which we have in our society, where there are people on bail who commit serious offences. And I suppose the reason I identified politicians as being different to other people before is that I know you, Chairman, and I know others here, have been in rooms with families who come to see us, and their son, their daughter, has been subjected to a very serious crime, murder, rape, and it's been committed by a person who is out on bail. And when they say to me, well, what are you as legislators, and that's what we are, we're legislators, what are you as legislators doing about this? I say, well, we changed the law. We had a constitutional referendum back in 1996. 75% of the population voted in favour of it, and we introduced legislation on foot of that. But we can see from these statistics that the legislation isn't working. Now, legislation isn't the only solution, but it's part of it. And that the only thing we do is we're legislators. We don't do much else. We can make the law. The reason why you're all here before Mick, Clare, myself and the others is because we make law. So we need to look at those areas where we think we can change the law and make it better. And I just want to say one or two other things. Like, I've really valued the work done by the IPRT, and I was recently at the launch of the report you had in respect to the prison system. Didn't see you there, Mick, but it was a fantastic report, and I commend you, and I support the work that you do in respect of prisoners' rights. But as you said in conclusion, Deirdre, they're not incompatible. Like, I believe we should reduce numbers in our prisons. I believe that we should promote and protect prisoners' rights. But at the same time, I know that there are extremely violent men in our society who attack women and who commit assaults on other men and who have murdered people. And, we can't just say, oh, well, we just need to broaden resources and legislation isn't the answer for this. It's the only answer we have in our toolbox, so that's why we look at legislation. But I think we need to recognise that there's an issue in respect of it. I don't believe the legislation is unconstitutional. We put in a provision in the Constitution which said you can refuse bail, a court can refuse bail, where it's reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence by that person. If a court believes that a person before it applying for bail is reasonably likely to commit a serious offence, the court should refuse bail. And we as the people in this country who make the laws should state that. And it isn't, I did use the term mandatory, but it doesn't remove judicial discretion from it, because the judge has to assess, well, is there a likelihood that they're going to commit an offence or not? And that's where there is discretion. And if a court believes that somebody is going to commit a serious offence, well, it should refuse them bail in those circumstances. I don't think it's going to have the effect of creating, quote, chaos on the landings. I think we need to recognise there's a small number of men in our society, and we've seen it recently, Chairman, in decisions of the court where they've been involved repeatedly in serious offences, and we as legislators need to take a step to deal with it. Just in respect of electronic monitoring, you're right, it is on the statute book. It hasn't been commenced as of yet. It's been on the statute book since 2007, hasn't been commenced in respect of bail. Like, I'm surprised if, we all believe we don't want to be putting people into prison unnecessarily. This is a means of keeping people out of prison. This is a means of monitoring people for the purpose of bail so you can identify where they are. It's not going to stop the commission of an offence, but it will assist the court and the Gardaí in detecting whether or not that individual was involved in the commission of an offence, and it will act as a serious deterrent. So we need to recognise that, just going the way we're going isn't a solution. But listen, I really want to thank you all for coming in. I found your contributions very helpful, and also the contributions of this excellent committee, and I'll take them on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Caoláin. And this is not the last that we will hear of this. I would be very confident. And, I want to, on behalf of the Justice and Equality Committee, thank you all for taking the time to be with us here this morning, for your very instructive opening submissions, which we've received in advance, and again to hear you elucidate on all of that. It's been very, very helpful indeed. So to Joan and to all involved in ADVIC, thank you very much indeed. To Deirdre, Fiona and Michelle from the Penal Reform Trust, thank you very, very much indeed. And to Mary and all the team at Trinity, thank you very much indeed for being here. So the Joint Committee is adjourned until 9 a.m. next Wednesday, the 12th of December. Gora Míle Maithagh.